After the release of Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes, fans were in love with the core gameplay of Metal Gear Solid 5 and itching for the full release. They would have to wait 18 long months, but eventually, Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain would be released to the public. The game would be universally acclaimed, with many praising it for its varied mechanics, level of player freedom, open world design, cast performances, and so much more. But now, it's been 9 years since the game's initial release, and I'm finally getting around to playing this game for the first time after hearing that it's one of the best stealth games ever made for nearly a decade. So, was all of that praise really deserved? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 17th in a series of videos where I'm playing every Metal Gear game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along in preparation for the release of Metal Gear Solid Delta later this year. And while you don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, you will be missing a lot of important context about my journey with the series if you haven't seen them, so I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you that want to go check those out first. But with that out of the way, Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain is an action-adventure stealth game developed by Kojima Productions and published by Konami in September of 2015. And while I know that I just said that you don't have to have seen my other Metal Gear videos in order to enjoy this one, I do heavily recommend that you watch my video on Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes if you're not already familiar with the game. The two games are really one part of a whole package, both in terms of story, but also in gameplay, and I don't really want to spend like 20 minutes in this video repeating things that I talked about in the first, so if you haven't seen it or you don't know about the game already, go ahead and check that out first. Or don't, and just enjoy this video anyway. And just as a heads up here, a couple of my recordings from this playthrough weirdly recorded in a much lower resolution, despite the fact that I never changed anything in my recording settings, and that weirdly, the resolution also would change back and forth frequently. So just a heads up, there's a couple stretches of footage here that are in a much lower resolution, but there's nothing I can do about it now, and the issue fixes itself pretty quickly, so just bear with me for a few minutes. The game opens with a quote reading, "It is no nation we inhabit, but a language. Make no mistake, our native tongue is our true fatherland." We then see a shot of what the game says is just another day in outer heaven, where a man starts playing a cassette tape labeled "From the Man Who Sold the World," before cutting to Snake waking up in a hospital bed after the helicopter crash in Ground Zeroes. One of the nurses is startled by the fact that we're awake, running out of the room and knocking things over on her way out. We then fade out to black, hearing a phone call where the caller simply says V has come to before hanging up. We then cut back to Snake in the bed, with a doctor coming into the room and telling us that we need to just listen to him and try not to panic, before he explains that Snake has been in a coma for the past 9 years. Snake, of course, starts to panic like any reasonable person would in this scenario, so they tranquilize him, and we cut to 1 week later. The doctor and the nurse set us up in our bed and explain that 9 years ago, we were in an explosion. Upon arriving at the hospital and being examined, they discovered 108 separate pieces of shrapnel, human bones, and even human teeth embedded in our body. They were able to remove the majority of them, but there were some pieces lodged into our heart and our brain that they can't remove, since doing so would mean killing us in the process. The doctor then shows us an x-ray of our upper body, telling us that we should look down at our arms and see for ourselves, and upon doing so, we see that Snake has also lost the lower half of his left arm in the explosion. Once again, Snake starts to panic, so they sedate us again, and we cut to another week later. The doctor tells us that we should be dead, and that there are those out there who wish we never would have woken up. Because of this, he says that they'll need to alter our appearance to hide us from our enemies. So we cut to a character creator? I was incredibly confused at first, but then I remembered that Metal Gear Solid 5 has a full Metal Gear Online mode, so it must just be the player's avatar to use for that. So I spent like 2 minutes throwing together an incredibly basic avatar, and closed out of the creator to continue the game, figuring that it wasn't really all that important to the overall experience. Once I'm done there, the doctor removes our facial bandages, saying that they had them on us more to hide our identity rather than cover up any wounds. He says that from this day on, our name is Ahab, and we see the nurse in the background start getting choked out by a mysterious figure and dragged out of sight. The doctor shows us some old photos from Mother Base before holding up the mirror again, saying that this is us as we've lived up until today, but that tomorrow, we become a phantom. Just then, the mysterious figure sneaks up on him and starts choking him out as well, causing him to kick us off the bed in his struggle. Once done with him, the woman then walks over to kill us as well, but just as she's about to shoot us, the patient from the next bed over throws himself onto her and the two of them start to fight. She eventually manages to throw the man off of her, and he starts picking up whatever he can from around the room to throw at her in self-defense, but she ultimately throws a knife into his chest and walks over to choke us out. As we're blacking out though, we hear the sound of a lighter, and we wake up to see that she's been set on fire thanks to a bottle of chemicals that was thrown on her. She flails around the room for a bit trying to put it out, before eventually falling out of the window in her struggle. The patient then walks over to us, saying that it's time to go. Snake asks who he is, to which he remarks that we're talking to ourselves, before explaining that his name is Ishmael and that he's been watching over us for the last 9 years. He tells us that the whole world wants us dead, and gives us a stimulant to help us actually get up and move before telling us to follow him out. The drug takes a little time to kick in though, so we slowly crawl around trying to keep up with him before eventually coming across a child wearing a gas mask at the end of a hallway. The child floats up through the ceiling before the elevator dings, and Ishmael says that something is coming. The whole hallway then suddenly bursts into flames, sending both of us flying back. A large flaming man then walks out of the fire, ominously moving towards us before a sprinkler goes off above him and he suddenly disappears into the smoke. We continue through the hospital, slowly sneaking our way past enemy soldiers who are purging all the patients and staff one by one in an effort to find us. We also have a couple more encounters with the psychic child and the man on fire before eventually making it out into the parking lot. Just as we make it outside though, the front doorway explodes and we find ourselves once again laying there helplessly as the man on fire walks towards us. Just as he reaches us though, he's suddenly slammed by an ambulance and Ishmael throws the door open, yelling at us to get in. As we're driving away from the hospital, flaming wreckage is continuously thrown at us, and we're eventually met with an enemy chopper that shoots through our windshield, with Ishmael being killed by the gunfire. We try to take control of the ambulance from the passenger seat, but eventually crash into a roadblock set up by enemy soldiers, sending us rolling into a ditch. This is an awesome opening to the game, though I can see it getting a little tiresome on repeat playthroughs. It's roughly an hour long from beginning to end, and the majority of that time is spent doing things like crawling through hallways and waiting for enemy soldiers to move on to the next room so you can continue. So while it is really tense and captivating for a first-time player like myself, I'm sure it'll be a chore to get through when I eventually come back to replay the game. Anyway, we wake up in the ambulance after being unconscious for a while, and Snake realizes right away that Ishmael has disappeared. We painfully pull ourselves out of the car, only to be met with an enemy gunship hovering overhead. The psychic child from earlier then appears in front of us, before a giant flaming whale flies into the chopper and eats it. Before we've even had time to process what the hell that just was, a flaming Pegasus then appears in the sky, with the psychic child and the man on fire riding on its back. Snake pulls himself to his feet and starts to run away, before a man rides up on a horse, saying that he's on our side and telling us to get on with him. Not having many other options, we do so, and he hands us a shotgun so we can try to hold off the flaming man. After a short chase through the woods, a bridge we're riding across is suddenly struck by lightning, sending us plummeting into the river below. Snake manages to pull himself out of the water, and we see the flaming man looking down on us from the bridge above, before the man with the horse picks us up and starts walking us back to the road. He tells us that his name is Ocelot, saying that we've already met before, and that there's a certain man who gave him 2 jobs to do. The first was to rescue Big Boss from the hospital, and the other was to go and rescue the man himself, Kazuhira Miller. He says that after Cypher's attack 9 years ago, we were presumed dead, and that the whole world was happy thinking that we were. He tells us that we'll have to join back up with Miller and rebuild our private army, saying that it's our only chance at survival. He gives us the rundown on the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, explaining that Miller was involved in the conflict there, but has now been captured by the Soviets and likely only has a couple weeks left to live. He tells Snake that Miller had no actual investment in the Afghanistan conflict and that he only took it on to keep us safe, before we come to a harbor, and he tells us that we'll be heading to Afghanistan on a whaling ship. While we're on our way there, we get this fun little training montage of Snake doing things like learning how to load a magazine with his new prosthetic arm, being given a new, much more advanced prosthetic by Ocelot, and of course, taking time for a little cigar break. Once we arrive, Ocelot sets us up with a horse of our own and tells us that the area Miller is being held in is under total Soviet control. He jokes that a solo infiltration of the main Soviet ground force should be the perfect warm-up for us after 9 years on ice, and sends us off to do our thing. And something that struck me as being very strange at this point in the game is just how uncharacteristically quiet Snake is. With all of the story content and conversations that we've gone through in this first hour or so of the game, Big Boss has spoken a grand total of 3 sentences, and all 3 of those were during that little exchange where he asked Ishmael who he was. Aside from that, he has quite literally not spoken a word up to this point. Rather than conversations in this game feeling like a natural exchange between 2 people like in previous Metal Gear games, it kind of just feels like the characters here talk at Snake and he just sits there blankly staring back at them like 95% of the time. And when he finally does speak, he doesn't really say much of anything, with lines like "what happened to the woman" or "who are you?" And I mean that quite literally. Those are 2 of the 3 lines that he's spoken at this point in the game. The third, for those wondering, was "what the hell is going on?" It makes the dialogue in this game feel really awkward, as everyone is basically just having a one-sided conversation with Big Boss, but as we'll come back to later, I think I understand why the writing style for the character changed so drastically here. It's also worth mentioning that Snake's codename has actually changed in this game. There's a cassette tape that you get pretty much right off the bat where Ocelot talks about what happened after the attack on Mother Base, and in this tape, he says that Snake went straight down to hell, but the doctors at the hospital pulled him right back out. He describes that when this happened, Snake's eyes were wide open, full of venom, before saying that the days of Naked Snake are gone, welcoming us back as Venom Snake. This new codename is very important to the story in a multitude of ways, so make sure you keep it in the back of your head throughout the video. Anyway, with Ocelot leaving us on our own to find Kaz, we're thrown into the real open world of MGS5. The map of Afghanistan is exceptionally large, and it's all open to explore as you please right from the start. When you're inside of main story missions, there will be boundaries on where you can and can't go, but these are normally really large open spaces that are playable, with players being able to wander off to other towns or camps that are completely separate from the main objective, and find optional side objectives that yield extra rewards in almost every single mission. And much like Ground Zeroes, this game looks great. It's not as intricately detailed or stylized as the map in Ground Zeroes, but you can just chalk that up to the scale that they were going for here in the Phantom Pain, and how unrealistic it would have been for them to add so much detail to every little area of the open world here. Things like the lighting and texture work are still top-notch though, and come on guys, they managed to make the desert still pleasant to look at by the end of a 50 or so hour playthrough, and that alone is a significant accomplishment. The design of the open world is also fairly interesting. It's basically a large open map with guard posts, camps, and bases dotted throughout, meaning that it's essentially like having a bunch of classic Metal Gear locations all stitched together by the open world. Unlike most modern open world games, the majority of these locations still feel very intentionally and lovingly designed, and I think I know why. Even though the entire map is open to you from the start, you'll end up visiting each of the major locations at some point during the main story missions of the game's campaign. When you go to these locations during the main story, you can kind of feel that they were made with that one specific mission in mind, and while being deployed to these missions, you'll also see the level designers that specifically worked on that mission being credited. This leads me to believe that all of these major areas were designed like a typical Metal Gear level, then spread throughout the open world to be fully explorable in free roam. It's a really great approach to take for transforming a more traditionally linear game formula into an open world formula, as it allows players to have the freedom that open world games are known for, while also having that tighter and more focused design that more linear games are known for. Some of the smaller checkpoints and guard posts are clearly just here to fill things out and aren't as intentionally designed, but most of the noteworthy areas in the map are great, so I found myself pleasantly surprised by the shift to open world here, especially since I'm not typically the biggest fan of the genre. And like I mentioned before, Ocelot provided Snake with a horse to be able to get around with, which makes getting from point A to point B a lot easier here. At any time you want to get around quickly, you can simply whistle and your horse will come right over to you so you can hop on and go. It probably goes without saying, but having a horse available to call at any time makes getting around the large open world a lot easier, so it's a very nice addition here. Aside from the addition of the horse though, the core gameplay is largely the same as what we got in Ground Zeroes. The movement feels tight and satisfying, CQC is as good as it's ever been, and interrogating soldiers is more valuable than ever. Along with marking things like weapons and ammo like they did in Ground Zeroes, interrogations can now also mark things like processed materials and rough diamonds, which are different forms of currency used for the long-term progression of the game. Certain items throughout the game will require certain types of materials to produce, and the rough diamonds are sold for cash as soon as they're acquired, so making sure that you interrogate the enemy soldiers and find every last one of these scattered throughout the open world just accelerates the rate at which you'll be earning upgrades throughout the game. And a really interesting twist to the interrogation mechanic is also thrown at players pretty much right off the bat. I went to interrogate the very first soldier that I snuck up on, and when he spoke Russian, I didn't get any English subtitles or any updates to the map. Ocelot then called over the radio to say that if we want to understand what the enemy soldiers are saying, we'll need to find an interpreter for their language to bring onto the team so we can have them translate it for us while we're out on our missions. This was a really fun twist, as it made it so that I couldn't just go out and start finding all the extra goodies right off the bat, and instead, I had to go out and find a Russian interpreter first. This applies to all the various languages that enemies will speak throughout the game, and while it never takes too long to find an interpreter after first encountering a new language, it is still a fun little addition to have. And the cherry on top of the open world is the addition of a day and night cycle. As you're playing the game, there's an in-game clock running the entire time, and what time it is in-game will be reflected not just by having it be day or nighttime, but even by the sun and the moon being in different positions in the sky based on what time it is, and even casting shadows in different directions based on their position. A 24-hour cycle in-game is roughly 6 hours in real life, meaning that while you're playing, you'll get about 3 hours of daytime followed by 3 hours of nighttime, assuming that there aren't any sort of time skips in there. This means that as you play, things like how much light there is, the directions shadows are being cast in, and more is constantly changing. And much like in Ground Zeroes, these things will make it easier or harder for patrolling enemies to detect you, meaning that players will always need to be on their toes and ready to adapt to these changes on the fly. The day and night cycle actually adds quite a bit to the gameplay, but it becomes more important as the game goes on, so we'll have to circle back to that later. Another pleasant surprise early on in the game was seeing that the tranquilizer gun actually has suppressor durability again. Like I mentioned in the Ground Zeroes video, the suppressor durability has always been the main thing keeping players from just spamming the tranq gun on every enemy soldier they see, so the removal of it just made non-lethal playthroughs way easier than they should have been. You can eventually work your way up to infinite durability suppressors for the tranq pistol here in the Phantom Pain, but it's something that you'll really only be able to achieve if you keep playing well past the game's ending, and I personally never managed to get that far during my over 80 hours of playtime. Regardless, the return of suppressor durability just means that you once again have to really think about when you're going to use tranks to knock out a guard versus when it would be better to save that durability and just use CQC, so I'm very happy that the infinite suppressor wasn't a core change that carried over to the entire game. After sneaking around and gathering some intel though, we eventually managed to find where Miller is being held. We break him out of the building that he's being held in and take him to the extraction that Ocelot has organized for us. Once we get there though, there's a heavy fog covering the landing zone, so the chopper has to find another place to touch down. Miller seems very put off by the fog before we're suddenly ambushed by a group of incredibly strange, seemingly enhanced soldiers. I try to sneak by them, but when I go to shoot one of them, he survives the shot to the head and materializes a rifle out of thin air and starts to move so fast that it's hard to even keep track of him. I give up on the idea of sneaking by them pretty much immediately after this, just throwing Kaz on the back of my horse and riding out of there. But as I'm doing so, the soldiers are able to easily outrun my horse, positioning themselves along the route I'm taking and trying to shoot me off of it. I eventually manage to clear the mist, and right when I do, we seemingly lose track of the soldiers. Miller explains that that was the same unit that attacked him before, saying that they attacked him in the mist just like what we saw a moment ago. We link back up with the extraction chopper and get Miller out of there, successfully completing our first real mission. Speaking of, helicopter extractions return and function pretty much exactly how they did in Ground Zeroes, but the shift to open world has actually led to some pretty interesting differences. When you deploy to a mission or just the open world map of Afghanistan, you'll go in with full ammo and suppressor durability on all of the weapons and items that you bring in with you. You can then go around the open world completing missions as you please, but if you want to resupply your ammo or suppressors, you'll have to either call in a care package to do so, or extract from the area and redeploy. Both calling in a care package and calling in an extraction will cost the player a bit of their money, meaning that there's no way to top up your supplies for free outside of just finding small stashes of items scattered throughout the open world map. This ends up fixing one of the biggest balancing issues that's existed in these mission-based Metal Gear games ever since Portable Ops, as you no longer get a full resupply every time you complete your objectives, you now have to actually spend some of your resources in order to do so. Back to the story though, while we're riding out in the chopper, Miller talks about how Cypher took everything that he and Snake built away from them. He says that we're going to rebuild it, showing Snake our new insignia, and telling us that from now on, we're Diamond Dogs. He also says that every night, he can still feel the leg and the arm that he lost, saying that he can still feel the pain of both his limbs and everything else he's lost, including Mother Base and their men at MSF. He tells Snake that he won't rest until we've taken back everything that we lost and made Cypher pay for what they did to us, and we arrive at our new Mother Base. He says that we need to build it up again just like before, except this time, there's no greater good or just cause behind it. From now on, we will be building up an army with the express purpose of taking our revenge on Cypher. Snake tells him that this isn't about the past, and that we're actually fighting for our future before the medical staff come to take him away and treat his wounds. And here, we get to freely walk around Mother Base, which isn't just a quick little moment for this point in the story, but is actually something players can do whenever they want now. Between missions, you can always choose to take a quick trip back to Mother Base, walking around and seeing everything get progressively larger as the game goes on, and spending some quality time with your men.
Thank you, boss. How about a mock battle?
You can also find some rough diamonds hidden around the base, which actually rewards you with a little bit of extra cash simply for taking the time to come back and hang out around the base. On top of that, each platform of the base has a target practice exercise which will award you with extra cash bonuses if you can complete them within the allotted time. These are really fun too. Except for the R&D platform target practice. Fuck that one. Your men seeing you around the base will also raise your staff's morale, not only preventing your men from leaving Diamond Dogs or getting into fights with one another, but also potentially boosting your staff's performance if it raises high enough. So overall, there are plenty of reasons to take a little time here and there to return back to Mother Base for a bit, and I personally found myself coming back all the time to really take in the scale of what I was building throughout the game. And like I just mentioned, the R&D team from Peace Walker returns here, and they're pretty much unchanged. You find soldiers out in the field that specialize in research and development, bring them back to the base and put them on the R&D team, and the more proficient your R&D team becomes, the more high-level gear they'll be able to produce for you to use in missions. There's nothing new or fancy when it comes to the R&D team specifically, but they're still the cornerstone of player progression throughout the game. The system already worked great in Peace Walker, so I guess this is one of those if it ain't broke, don't fix it situations. And during this first visit to Mother Base, Ocelot teaches us about the R&D team and how to manage our staff, and there's an interesting change that's been made here in terms of how you manage your men. Rather than going through and selecting who goes where manually like in Peace Walker, here in MGS5, every soldier is automatically assigned to a team immediately upon being brought into Diamond Dogs. There was a button to auto-assign soldiers back in Peace Walker, but if you had a team that was already at maximum capacity, the game wouldn't remove lower quality soldiers to replace them with the better options, and you would have to go through and do all that yourself if you wanted to really maximize MSF's effectiveness. In the Phantom Pain though, this has been changed and everything is completely automatic now. So if you bring in a soldier who's a better option than one that you already have assigned, the game will automatically remove that lower quality member from the team and replace them with the new one. For the vast majority of players, this will just be an objective improvement, but as weird as it might sound, I almost missed going through and assigning all of the men I brought in after every mission. It wasn't the smoothest system by any means, but it had a certain charm to it, and I feel like it made me more attached to my men as a result. And while we're going through all that with Ocelot, he also introduces us to the support unit, which is an entirely new addition here in the Phantom Pain. The support unit is responsible for handling things like your Fulton extractions, supply drops, fire support, just about anything that you'll be calling in during your missions to make your life a little easier. These guys are also responsible for interpreting other languages for you while you're out on missions, but this isn't necessarily a function of the entire unit, rather just a handful of specific soldiers within it. Which, as a side note, how fun is it that they've given the alternate language subtitles an in-universe explanation? It's those fun little details that just make me love Metal Gear. And lastly, Ocelot gives us a quick rundown on the CQC mechanics, and they're even better in MGS5 than I realized when I was playing Ground Zeroes. Everything I said about the CQC mechanics in that video still stands here, but some things have been tightened up even more, and there's one really fun addition as well. For the tightening up part, I never tried to just use basic attack strings to knock out my enemies in Ground Zeroes, but doing it here, I realized just how much more smooth and fluid it both looks and feels here in MGS5 compared to games like MGS3 or Peace Walker. And on top of that, there's a new addition in the form of disarming your enemies by pressing the left trigger mid-attack string, allowing for a slightly less practical, but way more badass method for holding up enemies. I wouldn't be shocked in the slightest if both of these qualities also apply to Ground Zeroes, and I just never found them in my very short time with the game, but regardless, the CQC here in MGS5 is fantastic, just the best in the series by a mile. Finally leaving Mother Base again and getting back into the field though, anyone who's played Peace Walker will be very familiar with the general formula of the game. You can deploy to the open world map to complete missions, gather resources, capture enemy soldiers to add to the ranks of Diamond Dogs, and even tackle side ops that are scattered throughout the map as well. The only major change here is that you don't have to go back to Mother Base between every mission. Unless you specifically want to go back to Mother Base or extract to change your loadout, you can go from one mission to the next without the need for any loading screens or time spent in the menus. Simply complete one mission or side op, and then open up your map and mark the location of the next one you want to go do, and make your way over there. You will eventually have to extract from the open world though, and thankfully when you do, the mission deployment menu has been changed up quite a bit, and it's a massive improvement over Peace Walker's. Your loadout is displayed on the right-hand side, and the UI is super clean and easy to understand, letting you quickly glance over at what you have equipped and make quick adjustments easily. In the bottom left, you'll also see your deployment costs, which is a new addition to MGS5. Every single item in this game has an associated cost in both GMP and specific resources that you'll have to pay in order to either deploy with them or call in a delivery of them mid-mission. I get what they're going for here, as the system is clearly intended to make players really think about whether or not they're going to need specific items on each individual deployment, preventing them from always just deploying with a full kit of whatever the best gear they have available is. And while I think that this is a great goal to shoot for and absolutely should be in the game, I'm not sure if I totally agree with the execution of it. There were a lot of instances in my playthrough where I brought something along like C4 thinking I would need it, but I would end up being wrong and just getting no use out of that item despite having already paid to bring it along with me. Along with that, I don't exactly love the idea of paying to bring along an item that I've already spent a ton of resources researching and producing. I think an awesome middle ground here would be keeping these costs exactly as they are when calling in a piece of gear mid-mission, as if you're calling it in after deploying, it just means that you didn't plan your loadout effectively. But rather than paying the full cost to simply deploy with the item, I think it would have been awesome to have players instead pay costs for using the item. This is something that another game series I've covered here on the channel, Armored Core, does, charging players for the costs of the ammunition they used, as well as the repairs to their mech after every mission. So instead of paying to deploy with the 4 pieces of C4 in my inventory, I would instead just pay for the 2 pieces that I actually used during my deployment. This would also make way more sense from an in-universe perspective, as we wouldn't have to throw out and produce more C4 just because I brought it along and never used it. We would only have to pay to replace the C4 that I actually blew up. The same could be said for ammo I never fired off, suppressors I never broke, you get the idea. Now, this could lead to a situation where players are able to go into missions more prepared, but they're more hesitant to use the gear that they've already brought. I fully recognize that that could be the case, and this isn't a perfect solution by any means, but I would say that it's at least preferable to the way the game works currently, where I felt hesitant to even bring gear along with me in the first place. Anyway, something else in the deployment menu that's returning from Peace Walker is that game's take on the camouflage system. When planning for a deployment, you can choose what fatigues Snake will be wearing, and while you don't have to engage with the system, I would heavily recommend that you do. Enemies in MGS5 are much more aware than they are in Peace Walker, so even if you do bring the right camouflage, they have a much easier time spotting you here than they did in that game. To make the most of the system, you'll really have to pay attention to the environments of every little area of the map. Are you deploying somewhere where there's a lot of open desert, maybe somewhere that's more rocky and mountainous, or maybe even a marshland? Each of these environments will benefit more or less from each specific camouflage, so really learning the open world map in and out and choosing the right camo for each deployment will make your time with MGS5 much easier than it otherwise would be. And much like Peace Walker, players will eventually be able to develop a new sneaking suit for Snake, but unlike that game, the sneaking suit is actually really well balanced here. When using the sneaking suit at nighttime, it's by far the most concealment you'll get out of any outfit in the game, but you can't simply wear it on every mission and get a great amount of concealment from it like in Peace Walker. If you wear the sneaking suit in the open desert during the day, enemies will easily spot you from very long distances, which makes sense as you're wearing all black in the middle of the open with the hot desert sun beating down on you. This essentially makes it so that if you're deploying at night, the sneaking suit is the optimal way to go, but if you're deploying during the day, it's actually one of your worst options. The sneaking suit does offer some additional benefits like dampening the sound of your footsteps and increasing the rate at which you'll heal from damage, so there are still some benefits to wearing it during the day, but you'll be taking that trade-off of being spotted much more easily. This is exactly the sort of balance I found myself wishing Peace Walker had, as I loved the camo system of that game in theory, but once you got the sneaking suit, there wasn't much reason to use anything else. Here in the Phantom Pain though, I was still carefully weighing my camo options all the way into the end game, so it's a massive improvement in my book. And once we're back out in the open world again, there are some fun new mechanics to start playing around with. The first, and one of the most helpful additions to MGS5, is the new stealth mode. This is essentially a stance that Snake will enter by laying completely still on the ground and pressing the Y button on the controller, where he'll flatten his body against the ground, making himself much more difficult to spot. With proper use of camouflage, stealth mode can make you practically invisible to enemies, with them not even realizing that you're there, even when they're only a few meters away from you. Simply laying down and entering stealth mode allowed me to set up some really effective ambushes all throughout my playthrough, and occasionally got me out of a really bad spot. More options being available to approach the stealth experience with is always a good thing in games like this, so this is another great addition if you ask me. Something else that's new is just the sheer amount of small things that can alert enemies now. When you're sneaking around, you'll always need to be careful of where you're stepping, as you might end up knocking over something like a bucket or a pot and making a ton of noise, drawing enemies to your location to see what the sound was. On top of that, enemies are now able to hear you doing things that they've never been able to hear in previous games, like interrogating other soldiers or even using the Fulton recovery system. This means that players who want to maintain stealth will need to take a moment to think before doing just about anything in MGS5. I've always felt that the appeal of stealth games, for me at least, is taking in everything in the environment and working within the rules of the sandbox to solve a very complex puzzle, so the game pushing players to slow down and be more methodical in their approach is great as far as I'm concerned. Yet another thing that factors into this game's more intricate gameplay are the various weather conditions you might have to deal with while playing. A couple of them are incredibly simple, with clear weather just being your basic stealth experience, and cloudier weather being that basic experience with a little less direct light exposing you. Beyond that though, there's a chance that it starts to rain while playing, which doesn't affect visibility any more than your basic cloudy weather, but does muffle the sound a lot. This means that you can crouch walk up behind guards without generating enough noise to be heard, or do things like interrogate other guards or use the Fulton a little bit closer than you otherwise would. But the most extreme, and my favorite of the bunch, are the sandstorms. These make it incredibly difficult for both the player and the enemies to be able to see or hear, but this actually can be used to your advantage. If you're neglecting to scout out locations and mark enemies beforehand, these sandstorms will catch you with your pants down, and you'll have to either take the risk of moving through them, or just hunker down and wait them out. But if you're playing the way the designers intended and you've marked all the enemies in the location before moving in, you'll be able to track their movements through the storm while they're barely able to see anything, allowing you to be a ghost in the storm. Or a phantom. No, that was terrible. I'm so sorry. After getting a few more missions under my belt, Ocelot calls in to tell us that he started up a base development unit for Diamond Dogs. This is another new team that MGS5 brings to the table, and they're probably my favorite out of all the newcomers. As you progress through the game, you'll be able to spend your resources on building new struts and additions to Mother Base, and these guys are the ones in charge of actually carrying out that construction. Building more facilities for each specific unit will allow you to staff more members in that unit, so if you want more R&D staff, you can build a new strut to facilitate that. Along with that, the base development unit is also in charge of processing any unrefined materials that you may come across out in the field, as well as passively mining for resources themselves while you're out on your missions. So the entire time you play, these guys are passively collecting extra resources in the background and then making those resources usable, meaning that they're a massive part of bringing in more wealth for Diamond Dogs. And obviously, the higher you raise the level of the base development unit, the more resources they'll be able to produce in a shorter amount of time. I love them not just because of the passive resource generation, but also because of the fact that they let players order new additions to Mother Base, which you can then go to see in person. It really adds to the feeling of building up this massive army when you see Mother Base grow more and more throughout the game every time you come back to it, so ultimately, I think that these guys are a great addition. And early on, while I'm still feeling out the game, I end up coming across a wild dog pup. I walked over to it, and after seeing the Fulton indicator, I had to know what would happen if I tried it, so I tossed a balloon on the little guy and watched him disappear into the sky. After a little more time in the field, Miller told me to come back to Mother Base, and when I arrived, I was greeted by Ocelot on the helipad. He has the dog pup with him, and he tells us that he's a bit of a troublemaker, but he could end up being useful when he's grown. He says that he could care for the pup for the time being while we're out in the field, and tells us that he's named the dog Dee Dee, which is of course short for Diamond Dog. So this random dog pup that I came across out in the field and threw the Fulton on almost as a joke ended up being the new literal mascot for Diamond Dogs, and again, it's just these little interactions and touches that make me love Metal Gear. Also during this return trip to Mother Base, I took the time to listen to some cassette tapes that I had gathered while playing, and some of these dropped some really important info on me. The first of these is one that confirms that Chico died in the helicopter crash at the end of Ground Zeroes, which also means that at least some of those bits of human bone and teeth found in our body when the hospital recovered us were likely little bits of Chico. Another tape here reveals that Huey worked so hard to convince Big Boss to bring the inspection into Mother Base back in Ground Zeroes because he was actually secretly working with Cypher and double-crossing us. Miller mentions in the tape that he has reason to believe that Huey is currently hiding out somewhere in Afghanistan, and that that's part of the reason he chose to take on a job in the region, as he was secretly hoping that he would find Huey and get the chance to question him about everything that happened 9 years ago. And these tapes actually bring me to what might be the largest flaw of the Phantom Pain's storytelling, that being that a ton of critical plot info is given to the player through these tapes, rather than being naturally worked into the gameplay or cutscenes. A lot of the story content that's told in these tapes is actually really captivating, but I really don't like the way that the game relies on them to communicate key info. I'm not even all that bothered by the fact that some players might just never listen to them, though that is an issue that should be acknowledged, but the real thing that bothers me is the presentation aspect of it. The Metal Gear games have had amazing cinematic presentation ever since Metal Gear Solid, and thanks to this game's reliance on cassette tapes to tell the story, MGS5 has much less of that cinematic flair when compared to previous games. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of cutscenes in this game that look absolutely fantastic, and you catch glimpses of that flair still being here, but unless the game has something very specific that it wants players to actually see with their eyes, it's more than happy to just have you sit through a straight 10 minutes of exposition instead. These tapes can be listened to during gameplay, but I found myself not really retaining much of the information in them if I tried to listen this way, as I was way more focused on actually playing the game. Like I said, it's not a problem with the story content of the tapes, but rather the fact that the content is given through these long stretches of exposition with no presentation to really speak of. Getting back in the field though, I go on a mission to rescue a Soviet engineer who specializes in bionics. Once he's back at Mother Base, we put him on the R&D team, which opens up the ability to develop new enhancements for Snake's bionic arm, and even new types of bionic arms entirely. This essentially acts like a skill tree for Snake, granting him entirely new abilities like being able to release an electric charge from the arm to stun enemies, or slam the ground with his arm to use the sound to pinpoint any living things in the surrounding area. A lot of these are also just passive upgrades that Snake gets to keep for the rest of the game, regardless of what arm is equipped, like increasing his crawling speed, reload speed, running speed, etc. These upgrades can make a big difference, and some of them, like the running speed upgrades, get absolutely ridiculous by the end of the game. I mean, just look at this. You'd think that I sped this up in the editing, but I didn't. Snake can just actually run this fast once you've gotten a couple upgrades. Having persistent upgrades like this isn't something that I would have expected from Metal Gear Solid 5, but they really make investing in Snake's bionic arms worthwhile. It's a great fit for a game of this style too, as you'll obviously want to invest your upgrades into something that you'll never lose regardless of what gear you're using, so I think they're a good addition overall. A couple missions later, I'm sent in to extract a new experimental rocket launcher from the US known as the Honeybee so that we can reverse engineer it back at Mother Base. The mission goes pretty smoothly, and I end up getting the thing with no problem, but while I'm on my way out, the area is suddenly covered in a very thick mist. The psychic child from the hospital then floats past us before we hear a loud noise behind Snake, and a giant mechanical hand suddenly reaches out and grabs him. We're held upside down by the hand, and a man walks out of the fog, greeting us as Big Boss and remarking that we've become a demon. He gets face to face with Snake, and we can see that it's Skullface before we hear the sounds of gunfire behind us and see some figures leaping around in the fog. Skullface tells Snake that he'll see him in hell, walking away before the giant hand releases us, and we see a nearby soldier seemingly having his life drained from him. The skulls then run towards us from the mist, and the soldier stands back up, seemingly possessed after whatever they did to him. Ocelot chimes in over the radio, saying that it might be time to see what the Honeybee can really do, so I use the lock-on functionality to battle the skulls, picking them off one by one with the new launcher. I eventually manage to bring all of them down, and we head for the extraction with the Honeybee still in hand. On the way out, Snake calls Miller, telling him that the skulls were attacking the Soviets as well, meaning that they and Skullface must be working for Cypher. And this was the first mission since the introduction that really felt like it was moving the plot along. It not only gave Snake his first face-to-face encounter with Skullface, but also showed us that the skulls aren't actually the invincible soldiers that we believed them to be at the beginning of the game. And that actually brings us to something that I realized pretty early on in my time with MGS5, and that's that there are a lot of main story missions in this game that aren't actually very important to the plot of the game. Especially in the early half of the game, there are a lot of main missions that just feel like filler from a story perspective, and even from a gameplay perspective, they're essentially just side ops on a larger scale. You'll go into an enemy camp to do something relatively mundane like rescuing a prisoner, and Miller or Ocelot will say something about how saving that prisoner will get us one step close to Cypher, but that often just isn't the case. The designers of the game probably just wanted to ease players into the new gameplay formula before really dumping a lot of important plot info on them, but front-loading the game with a bunch of filler missions like this probably wasn't the way to go about that. If they really didn't want to overwhelm players by having them adjust to the new gameplay and learn what's going on in the story at the same time, they could have actually done what Peace Walker did in its final chapter of the game and forced the player to go out and complete some side ops before opening up the new main story missions. It's not a fatal flaw or anything, it just means that some of the missions don't really feel like you're doing anything that's all that important, and also makes the game's pacing feel really odd, which is something that we'll likely talk about again before the end of the video. Anyway, with the threat of Skullface and the skulls now being fully out in the open, we start up an intel team much like the one we had back in Peace Walker. And these guys do everything that they've done in previous games. They send agents out into the field and gather intel and leads that might give us some sort of advantage in our quest to bring down Cypher. But they also have some new functionality here in MGS5. Firstly, they can now inform you of medicinal plants in the area that you might want to gather for your R&D team. They also now give you a heads up on enemy movements, warning you about things like trucks of soldiers moving through the area or even just random foot patrols. And finally, they can also now inform you of incoming weather conditions like sandstorms, so you can be fully prepared to take advantage of them. The enemy movement and weather updates are super helpful, and the higher the level of your intel team, the earlier you'll be given the warning, meaning that you have more and more time to prepare and take full advantage of those conditions as you get further into the game. They aren't the flashiest team in Diamond Dogs, but their work really does go a long way, so players will still want to make sure that they're staffing the intel team properly. Around this time, we also start up a medical team for Mother Base, and once again, this team is very similar to what we've seen in previous games. As in-game time passes, certain members in Diamond Dogs might become sick or get injured, and when they do, they'll have to go to the sick bay for treatment. The higher the level of your medical team, the faster these men will be treated and be able to return to their jobs. Once again, nothing fancy here, but they are still an important part of the operations at Mother Base. Having these new teams at our disposal is really important, as this is also the point in the game where the difficulty really starts to pick up. The further you get into the game, the more well-equipped your enemies become. Over time, they'll gain new upgrades like body armor to absorb damage, helmets that protect them from headshots, or night vision goggles to see you in the dark. By the end of the game, enemies will be totally decked out with upgraded gear, but luckily, there is a way to counteract this. Shortly after the enemies start getting these upgrades, we also open up a combat unit back at Mother Base, and these guys act as a direct counter to the enemy's progression. Members of the combat unit can be sent out on dispatch missions, and some of these involve sabotaging the enemy's resources, like sending them to destroy a shipment of body armor or sniper rifles. This takes some time for them to do, with each dispatch mission having a specified amount of real-world time that needs to pass before they're complete, typically somewhere around 20 to 40 minutes, though there are some that go upwards of 2 hours. This means that as long as you're on top of managing your combat unit, you'll be able to keep the enemies relatively weak for the majority of the game, which I actually think is a really interesting way of going about it. This approach means that there's yet another direct gameplay reward for players who actually put a lot of effort into the base management aspects of the game, which I think is a really positive thing to have. A little bit after this introduction, I'm going through the open world, checking missions off the list as usual, when I'm suddenly shot off my horse by a sniper. This immediately forces me into a boss fight with the sniper that feels like a much more tense and refined version of the Sniper Wolf fight from MGS1. We're in this absolutely massive area with lots of vantage points and things to hide behind, and we get into an incredibly tense game of cat and mouse with them. The sniper is a crack shot, being able to hit Snake if he's in the open for so much as a second, and as soon as you return fire, she'll move incredibly quickly to reposition and try to get the drop on you again. It's also a little bit reminiscent of the encounter with the End from MGS3, as our back and forth lasted for so long that night had already fallen by the time I actually brought them down. Once I've won the fight, I walk over to where they went down, finding that it's a legendary female sniper from the area who's known by the Soviets as Quiet. Miller tells us that she works for Cypher and that we need to finish her off, but Ocelot says that we could use skills like hers, and we're given the option to either kill her or take her in. I of course choose the non-lethal option, handcuffing her and bringing her to a helicopter for extraction. Miller and Ocelot continue to argue with each other while I wait for the chopper to arrive, and Miller eventually tells us that if we bring her back to Mother Base, he'll just have her killed anyway. We load her up on the chopper, and just as we're taking off, she suddenly jumps awake again, slipping out of her cuffs and throwing a jacket at us so she can quickly disappear out the side door. Miller says good riddance, but Ocelot is disappointed, saying that she's a one-of-a-kind find. As we're on our way back to Mother Base, we're attacked by a fighter jet, and Miller tells our pilot to shake it off before we end up leading it back. The pilot does his best to outmaneuver the thing, but it definitely has the upper hand, and Snake tries to get on the minigun at the door before he's suddenly thrown off of it, and Quiet materializes out of thin air, using the gun to shoot a missile out of the sky. She hands the gun off to Snake, grabbing her rifle off the wall instead, and she manages to shoot the jet's pilot right in the head as he flies by. She then very politely unloads the rifle and hands it back to Snake before putting the cuffs back on herself and having a seat. When we arrive back at Mother Base, we're greeted by some of our choppers with weapons aimed at us, and Miller yells up at us from the helipad to not let Quiet set foot on the base. He reminds Snake that she's with Cypher, but Snake steps aside and allows her to jump out the side door of the chopper, with her landing behind Miller and his men and slipping out of the cuffs again. Miller tells the men to fire on her, but Ocelot jumps in and tells the men to stand down, arguing that she saved the boss. Snake then walks up, telling them to put her in a cell and keep an eye on her, and silently putting his hand on her shoulder as if to tell her that it will all be alright. Miller keeps saying that we'll regret this, and Snake tells him that one of these days we'll have to kill her, but now just isn't the time. He says that when the time comes, he'll personally pull the trigger, and Kaz storms off out of frustration. And at this point in the game, I had started to get comfortable with how everything worked, so I started to experiment with various loadouts and different approaches to certain situations, and it was here that I discovered the real magic of MGS5. As much as you can approach everything in the game using the classic Metal Gear strategies, the game is made to be this giant stealth sandbox, and as such, there are countless ways to tackle just about every challenge it presents. I personally had a blast doing things like trying to use perfect stealth during the destroy armored vehicle unit side ops rather than just rolling up with launchers and destroying everything. As much as just running in with an RPG and blowing these units up would work perfectly fine and probably be faster, it was also just so satisfying to slowly pick off the infantry guards and extract them one by one before setting up a trap or some C4 to destroy the vehicles before they even know what hit them. I did still find myself relying on the old faithful setup of a silenced assault rifle and a tranquilizer pistol a lot, but replacing those with a double-barreled shotgun and an SMG that fires rubber bullets or some other random loadout could really spice up the gameplay and just make things a lot more interesting. I did a ton of experimenting with my loadouts and my approaches during my playthrough, and it definitely made MGS5 way more enjoyable than it otherwise would have been. The sandbox design and level of player freedom here is really damn good, and it says a lot that it manages to keep the game entertaining for the duration of its very long runtime. I play the game for another few hours, just carrying out missions like usual, until I'm suddenly called back to Mother Base immediately after a mission. I'm told by Miller on the way in that we've been contacted by a scientist who wants to defect from the East, and that this scientist's name is none other than Huey Emmerich. He's being held at a power plant in Afghanistan, and he's requesting that we're sent out to rescue him. After this, I land and go around Mother Base checking in on things for a few minutes, and just as I'm about to leave, I'm stopped by Ocelot, who's accompanied by a fully grown Didi. Didi jumps into the chopper, and Ocelot says that he's coming with us, meaning that we now have our second buddy of the game, the real Diamond Dog. And this brings us to the Phantom Pain's buddy system. I mentioned earlier that Ocelot set us up with the horse in this game, but what I didn't mention was that this horse is simply the first buddy that's made available to you. When deploying on missions, you can choose one buddy to accompany you during that deployment, and each of them have their own unique skills and benefits that they bring to the table. D-Horses is incredibly straightforward, simply offering a convenient means of transportation around the open world. But now that we have Didi on board, things start to get a lot more interesting. He'll follow us around the open world, sniffing out guards and prisoners and marking them for us passively as we go along. He can even mark these guys from over 100 meters away, meaning that when you have Didi along, you can pretty much get away with just heading right into camps and bases without doing any scouting, as he'll just mark anyone who's remotely close to you as you go. You can also outfit him with a sneaking suit of his own, equipping it with a knife or a stun gun depending on your preference, and allowing him to kill or knock out guards for you on command. This makes Didi an incredible buddy to bring along for stealth purposes, and he's probably my favorite buddy in the entire game as a result. I mean, who doesn't want to go driving around Afghanistan with man's best friend riding passenger? And that actually brings us to how vehicles in this game work. They can of course be found out in the field at camps and bases like you might expect, but if you upgrade the Fulton recovery system enough, you can use it to extract these vehicles and add them to your arsenal back at Mother Base. You can then send one of these captured vehicles out on dispatch missions with your combat unit, or choose to deploy with one of them yourself when you go out into the field. This is especially helpful when using a buddy that isn't D-Horse, as just bringing a simple car can make getting from point A to point B much easier and more convenient. We were able to collect vehicles and send them out on missions back in Peace Walker, but being able to deploy with them ourselves is a totally new addition, and one that adds a lot of fun to the game. And after taking Didi out on a couple missions to get used to him, I make my way over to where we believe Huey Emmerich is being held to rescue him. When I get there, I find that he's developing a new Metal Gear for XOF, and overhear him arguing with Skullface. He tells Skullface that it's not ready yet and that he needs more time to finish it, but Skullface throws him down a nearby staircase and reveals that he knows that Huey contacted us in an attempt to defect. He tells his men to move Huey to another nearby base, so we have to go out and track him down again. Once we do so and reach the base that he's been taken to, we run into some new bipedal units that he produced called Walker Gears. These are essentially like mini little mechs that can be used to protect the pilot from enemy gunfire, as well as allow for much enhanced firepower. They have a glaring weakness, however, with the pilot being completely exposed from behind, meaning that we can actually still sneak up on men in Walker Gears and just yank them right out of them to maintain stealth. They're a pretty intimidating new hazard when you first run into them, but once you figure out how to deal with them, they're actually pretty easy to get around. We eventually reach the building he's being held in, and when we do, we find the boss AI pod from Peace Walker in the room with him. We walk over to him, and he can barely recognize us, likely because of all the damage to our face. Snake doesn't waste any time, quickly throwing a bag over his head and carrying him out to the extraction point. As the helicopter lands to pick us up though, something huge suddenly falls out of the sky and we see Huey's new Metal Gear rise out of the smoke. Huey says that it's impossible for it to be active, and Skullface calls out to us from the Metal Gear's hand. He tells Huey that he's as useless as ever, revealing that this new weapon is known as Metal Gear Sahelanthropus. It then gently places Skullface back in his chopper before chasing us down to kill us. We get a really intense escape sequence where we have to run away from Sahelanthropus and then use the rocky terrain to hide from it so we can sneak back to our extraction little by little. I eventually managed to get myself and Huey on board the extraction chopper, but on our way out, we have to use the chopper's minigun to defend ourselves from Sahelanthropus as it tries to take us out of the sky. We eventually managed to knock the thing back on its ass, and Huey continues to question how they could have completed the weapon without him as we fly back to Mother Base. Once there, Miller and Ocelot waste no time interrogating Huey about the attack on Mother Base 9 years ago. Miller tells him that everyone lost something that day except for Huey, who conveniently was spared and taken away by the Cypher forces before they sank the base. Huey isn't giving them much in terms of answers, so Miller goes into the observation room to ask Snake what he thinks, and Snake tells him that they need proof before they can do anything to him, also saying that they're going to need to protect him since the men of Diamond Dogs will likely want his head. Ocelot then walks in as well, relaying to us that Cypher apparently stopped sending funding to Afghanistan, instead sending all of their funding to some secret research going on in Central Africa. All that Huey knows about it is that it's supposed to be a weapon to surpass Metal Gear, so we all agree that we need to get to Africa and find out what they're working on. Not long after, we get back into the field, deploying to Africa this time instead of Afghanistan. This was an incredibly pleasant surprise for me, as what little footage I had seen of MGS5 over the years had always been in Afghanistan, so I genuinely had no clue that I would be deploying to other locations throughout the game. And of course, Central Africa serves as a whole second open world map for the game, and is the primary location for the remainder of the campaign. It's designed in a very similar way to the Afghanistan map, and also looks really damn pretty a lot of the time, so I found myself enjoying my time in the Africa map just as much as in the Afghanistan one. During our first mission here, we're tasked with shutting down an oil field facility that's been leaking crude oil into the nearby waters. I slowly make my way through the facility, and when I eventually shut it down, a bunch of strange corpses float to the top of the oil. They have these very odd-looking growths on their chests, but shutting down the facility has enemy reinforcements rushing into the area, so we're forced to extract from the area before we can get a closer look at them. And after extracting, we get a call from Huey, with him telling us that he's finished work on a walker gear that we can use for our deployments, giving us the third buddy of the game. This little fella is called D-Walker, and he's a fully upgradable and customizable walker gear for us to use as we please. The deployment costs on this guy are really high, but you can get a ton of utility out of his increased armor and firepower. Like I said, he's fully customizable, so you can give him weapons like a minigun, a flamethrower, akimbo tranq pistols, you name it. On top of that, there are various arms that you can equip him with, allowing you to do things like use CQC to knock out enemies, or equip him with a machete for some quick up-close kills. He's a really fun buddy to play around with, but the expenses on both producing the gear and deploying are super high, and he's easily the worst in the game when it comes to stealth gameplay, so he's the one that I found myself using the least during my first playthrough. Super fun idea, but just not the sort of buddy that you'll really get much use out of until the end game, or maybe even until your second run. Not long after this, I also get a call from Ocelot, with him asking me to come back to Mother Base and give Quiet a visit in her cell. So I head back, and when I get there, Ocelot starts to explain what's been going on with her ever since we brought her in. He says that she refuses to wear clothes and that she never speaks, sweats, or breathes. Snake is very reasonably confused by this, so he further explains that she breathes through her skin and that wearing more clothing would suffocate her. As he's explaining this, we see her walk over to the shower and start shaking, and Ocelot points out that she's drinking the water through her skin. She apparently hasn't eaten anything since arriving either, and the medical staff believe that she uses some form of photosynthesis to feed herself. Ocelot tells us that even though she doesn't speak, she does understand and respond to English, so if we wanted to take her out on missions and make use of her incredible skills, we're completely free to do so. So from this point on, we can deploy with Quiet as our buddy, and she's probably the most interesting buddy in the game. Instead of strictly following you like Dee Dee or staying where you left her like D-Horse or D-Walker, she'll instead move from one sniper perch to another, doing her best to keep an eye on you and your surroundings from a distance. While up there, she'll kind of mark enemies for you, but only the enemies that she's directly aiming at, and if she looks away to aim at someone else, you'll lose the mark unless you go and mark that enemy yourself. When she's aiming at an enemy, you can order her to fire at any time, or you can simply wait and let her do her thing. She'll automatically fire on an enemy if they spot you and trigger reflex mode, which, while helpful for maintaining stealth in theory, does have a couple downsides. These downsides both come from the fact that she rocks an unsuppressed lethal sniper rifle by default, so if she does fire on an enemy to prevent them from raising the alert, everyone in the area will hear her rifle go off, and she'll also kill the target, meaning you can't capture them and bring them back to Mother Base if you wanted to. This makes her a little awkward to bring along early in the game, but as you develop new weapons for her to use, you can eventually work your way up to a suppressed tranquilizer rifle, which takes her from an awkward hindrance to one of the best stealth assets in the game. She'll also automatically fire on enemies in the event of a combat alert, which again, can cause some issues early on, but with the later rifles, allows her to clear camps and bases non-lethally entirely on her own. She's an incredibly strong buddy by the late game, and I found myself ultimately using her almost as much as I use Dee Dee, but that awkward start that she has means that you really won't get much use out of her until pretty late into the game. As I'm trying to get used to having quiet on the team though, we get a mission where we have to extract the cargo of a local private forces convoy that is believed to be transporting a payment for Cypher. So I get out in the field and clear out a camp along their expected route, waiting to ambush them when they arrive. They eventually do, and as I'm moving to extract the truck, 4 skulls suddenly come flying out of the back of it, but this time they're covered in some sort of new body armor. Miller chimes in over the radio, saying that if the skulls are on guard duty for this convoy, then that means that this has to be cargo for Cypher. So I slowly sneak around, waiting for my opportunity to get in and Fulton the truck. I eventually manage to get it out of there and quickly escape from the area without the skulls ever having seen me. And once we're safely out of the area, Miller calls in to explain what they found in the truck. The main item of interest was a small amount of yellow cake, which is a type of uranium powder that's used in nuclear weapons production. He does note, however, that it's such a tiny amount that they couldn't possibly make any sort of nuke out of it, so we aren't really sure what they're doing with it. We're also told here that the private forces in the area are all talking to one another and saying that we were the ones who brought whatever strange disease led to those corpses we saw back at the oil refinery, meaning that none of them are really sure where it's coming from either. A couple missions later, we're sent on a mission to eliminate a bunch of prisoners before they give up any information to their captors. But when we arrive, we find that the prisoners are actually just a group of kids. Snake dumps a full magazine into the cave wall, and Miller sends over the recording of the screaming and gunfire to the client to convince them that the kids have been eliminated. We free the kids from their cell, and we get this really tense escape where we have to protect the kids from enemy forces while taking them back to extraction. Once we've gotten them out of the area, we take them back to Mother Base, where Miller asks Snake what he wants to do with them. Snake says that they're tougher than they look, and with a little training, they'll be able to make themselves useful, but Miller doesn't like the idea of turning them into soldiers for Diamond Dogs. He says that they'll teach the kids how to read and write, as well as do some basic jobs around the base, wanting to give the kids the closest thing to a normal life that we can. And I know that I've said it at least once per game that he's featured in, but I love these moments where we see glimpses of that darker side in Big Boss. Fans who have stuck with the series for years will obviously know that he ultimately becomes a villain down the line, so seeing those little hints that he has that sort of mentality in him deep down is always just really cool. And this little glimpse is especially interesting, as fans who have played Metal Gear 2 might recall that the base in Zanzibar land had a bunch of children running around that Big Boss was giving a home to, but not making soldiers out of. Just a really nice touch to be able to see where he would have originally developed that mindset. Continuing through the campaign though, we're sent on a mission to rescue a friend of the boys that we saved earlier. This friend has apparently been taken to a place that the locals call the Devil's House, and they say that no one who gets taken there is ever seen again. So we make our way there, and the valley that we have to move through to get there is strangely covered in this incredibly thick mist that isn't present in any of the surrounding area. I sneak through the mist, eventually reaching the Devil's House, and as I enter, I am immediately greeted by hallways that are absolutely coated in blood. I continue making my way through, and I find some live individuals with incisions in their throats that have had earbuds hooked up to radios stuck in them. Snake also removes a sheet from one of the subjects, finding the same growths on his chest that we saw back at the oil refinery. I continue through room after room of these test subjects on tables before eventually finding the boy that I was sent in for. We tell him that his boys sent us and start cutting him loose, but as we do, he continuously repeats the phrase "kill me." We then hear a door in the next room open, shortly before seeing Skullface walk over to another subject and tell him to rest in peace before drawing his gun and shooting him in the head. The boy starts to panic, continuing to scream "kill me" over and over again, which draws Skullface's attention and blows our cover. He tells us to burn with the rest of them, and we see the psychic child from earlier appear behind him before being suddenly ambushed by the man on fire. We quickly turn and run out of the building, holding off the man on fire for a short time by using water tanks in the area before extraction finally arrives and we manage to escape from him. Once we're safe, Miller calls in asking what XOF is doing feeding radios and tape recordings into test subjects' throats like that, and wondering how it could possibly be connected to whatever disease they all seem to have. A couple missions later, I'm on a deployment like normal, but Miller gives me an emergency call saying that Mother Base is under attack and I need to return immediately. I do so, and when I get back, the whole base is under enemy control and I need to sneak through to find the enemy's commander and put a stop to the occupation. I wasn't exactly expecting there to be a mission where we sneak around Mother Base taking down enemies, but I have to say, it was a pretty damn fun surprise. I eventually managed to find the commander and tranquilize him, which causes the enemy forces to surrender. And this mission is actually an introduction to something much larger, that being the FOB infiltration mode. This is an online mode where you can attempt to infiltrate other players' bases in order to steal guards, resources, and more from them as a reward for doing so. If you fail the infiltration, however, you'll not only lose some resources yourself, but that player will then also be able to get revenge on you the next time they log into the game, with them being given the opportunity to infiltrate your base and steal your things. There's a lot to this mode, including an entirely new category of R&D research for things that can act as defenses for your base, but I personally didn't delve too much into it since I'm way more interested in covering the single player content of these games than the multiplayer. It seems like it's super fun to get into if modes like this are your thing, but if they're not, you can easily ignore it entirely and just play the rest of the game without touching it like I did. A bit further into the game, we get sent into a village that's been completely taken over by a rogue group of child soldiers. We're completely forbidden from killing any of the kids, with Miller telling us that if we do, the mission will be an instant failure. Our job is to infiltrate the village and extract their commander, who's known as the White Mamba, so that the group will stand down. So I go in with a full kit of non-lethal weapons and slowly make my way through the village, tranquilizing the children one by one as I go. And this was the mission that made me fall in love with using tranquilizer round sniper rifles in this game. It's all the joys of picking off targets from a distance one by one, but in a way that still allows you to capture all of them and add them to the ranks of Diamond Dogs afterwards. Anyway, I eventually reach the White Mamba, and we get into this pseudo boss fight with him. He's able to tank a shocking amount of tranq rounds and runs around trying to find places to hide and set up an ambush for us with his machete. Not the most difficult encounter in the game by any means, but one that definitely posed more of a challenge than I had thought it would going in. I eventually managed to knock him out and bring him to the extraction chopper, and it's during this cutscene that I suddenly go, holy shit, is that Liquid Snake? He bears a striking resemblance to the character, and we know from previous games that he was actually a child soldier when he was younger, so it really made me wonder if it could have actually been him. Once we have him back at Mother Base, he attempts to challenge Big Boss again, taking a knife to him before getting quickly disarmed and dropped on his ass. Snake tells him that we have rules around here, and to never draw a weapon on a fellow soldier. He says that anyone at Mother Base can use a knife or a gun, but he'll have to learn how to use his head before he's allowed to leave. The White Mamba then shoots him a glare before walking off with the other kids, and we take a little cigar break to celebrate another job well done. Shortly after this, I get a tape from Miller where he explains what he's learned about the White Mamba since he arrived. A couple things that are particularly of note are that his first name is Eli, and that he got angry at a guard and yelled at him in perfect English, meaning that it's likely his first language. Again, only feeding into the possibility that it could be Liquid. And after completing some more missions, we return to Mother Base again to find that Quiet has broken out of her cell and is attacking one of our men by trying to stick a knife in his mouth. Snake pulls her off of him and disarms her before Ocelot comes over with a sedative to knock her out. Snake tells Ocelot to tighten security on her cell, saying that if this happens a second time, there won't be a third. During this return trip, we also get a call from Miller, who says that he wants to perform a genetic test on Eli to see if he's a product of the Les Enfants Terribles project. We recently got word that one of the subjects disappeared somewhere in Africa, and he just wants to make sure that we're not dealing with them. He says that he'll do it covertly so that Eli doesn't notice, but it will take some time for them to get the results from it. So I go out doing some missions, and I eventually get a call from Miller telling me that they're seeing symptoms of that strange infection back at Mother Base. He says that the blisters on the body were full of tiny worms that we believe to be some sort of parasite larva. He tells us that we don't know the root of the infection or what causes symptoms to develop, but that this must be the weapon of mass destruction that Cypher was working on in Africa. Ocelot then jumps in, telling us that we have to set up a quarantine and attempt to figure out what's causing the virus to spread. If we even suspect that one of our men is infected, we need to put them into quarantine before their symptoms develop in order to slow the spread of the infection. We have a few men who are already symptomatic in the quarantine facility, so we have a handful of confirmed cases that we can use to find some sort of signifier of the infection. And this was a super stressful spot to be put in. If you quarantine any men who aren't infected, you're basically condemning them to a painful death along with the others, but if you don't quarantine those who are infected, it will spread through the base like wildfire and cause way more deaths than it otherwise would if you had just taken that risk. So I go through the small list of confirmed cases, looking extremely closely at every little thing on their files to try to figure out what these men might share with one another. I spent a good 5 minutes just combing through every little detail, but couldn't really find anything that seemed like it would actually confirm that they were carrying the infection, and started to get pretty frustrated because of it. I decided to take a break for a few minutes and come back to it with a fresh mind, so I go to listen to some new cassette tapes I had gathered. Coincidentally, in one of these, Ocelot speculates that Quiet might somehow be able to detect the infection, and she might have taken a knife to that soldier's mouth earlier in an effort to prevent the infection from spreading. Miller says that it's a ridiculous theory, and there's no way that she can detect the infection, nor that it likely has anything to do with the mouths of the carriers. But with those thoughts in mind, I go back to the files again, and I look through, noticing that all but one of the quarantined men speak Afrikaans. This caused me to be really frustrated again, as it felt like I was so close to the solution, only for there to be one exception out of the bunch that threw a wrench in it. So I look over it again, this time noticing that every single one of them speaks Kikongo. This being the best lead that I have, and not wanting everyone on the base to start dropping like flies if I don't do anything, I went through the files of every last soldier we had staffed, ultimately quarantining just short of 400 men who spoke Kikongo. There was a chance that this wasn't what was causing it, but again, it was better to quarantine some men who weren't actually carriers than to let it run wild out in the open. And even though things are seemingly under control now, we still have roughly 400 men in quarantine who will die from the infection if it's not treated, so we head back into the field in the hopes of finding a way to cure it. We eventually get word of a man in the area working with Cypher who knows how to treat the pathogen, so we head out to secure him and bring him back to Mother Base. The mission to rescue this guy is probably the best in the entire game, as it's the one that feels the most distinctly Metal Gear in my opinion. We deploy close to where we believe he's being held, but as we make our way through the valley there, we're suddenly surrounded by a thick mist before being ambushed by 4 sniper skulls. This is a really tense encounter, as all 4 of these enemies have abilities that are basically identical to Quiet. Funny enough, I had actually brought Quiet along with me for this mission, so it ends up being this intense 2v4 sniper battle in this incredibly foggy valley. Quiet manages to bring one of them down, but the others quickly return fire and knock her out, leaving me to deal with the remaining 3 all on my own. So, with a little skill and a lot of patience, I eventually managed to do so, and with a moment to breathe, I call in Dee Dee to take Quiet's place for the rest of the mission and move forward. From here, we come across a large mansion in the middle of the jungle where we believe the target is being held. As with most things in MGS5, there are numerous ways into the mansion, and players are free to tackle the infiltration however they like, but the difference here is that this mansion is absolutely swarming with guards. It's definitely the most heavily guarded area in the entire game up to this point, which really makes you wonder just how important this VIP really is to Cypher. I sneak in and reach the basement of the mansion, eventually finding a man sitting in the middle of a large room full of candles, but the wind from the door blows out all of the candles as we enter. The man tells us that he's been waiting for us to arrive, and all of the candles in the room then light back up. Miller tells us that that's the man we're looking for, and that he's known by the locals as the Code Talker. We show him pictures of the infection back at base, and he tells us to be silent, saying that it could be in our throats. He has us sit down and tells us that the parasite has infected our men. He explains that the parasites enter the throat and attach themselves to the host's vocal cords, and when they reach maturity, certain vibrations from the vocal cords will cause them to mate with one another, giving birth to their larvae. These larvae will then move down to the host's lungs and feed on them until it inevitably kills them. He says that each strain of the parasite reacts to different sounds found in different languages, and he can't possibly know what strain we have at our base, but that silence is the best way to prevent them from laying their children. We ask him if there's a cure, and he says that once symptoms manifest in a host, there's nothing that can be done, but there is a way to prevent the onset of an infection. He tells us that Skullface forced him to do his dirty work over the last few years, and now it falls to him to set things right, agreeing to come with us and treat our men. As we're carrying Code Talker out, he explains that Skullface's ultimate goal with the parasite research is to use them as ethnic cleansers, eradicating all languages other than English off the face of the earth. This is what we saw back in the Devil's House, as the radios and tape recordings were all being used to train the parasites to detect the sounds of specific languages. We eventually reach the extraction point and leave to take Codewalker back to Mother Base. While we're flying back, Code Talker explains that he has a way to force a mutation in the parasites that turns the males into females, preventing them from being able to reproduce and create the larvae. The downside to this method, however, is that the host will be affected by this as well, as anyone who undergoes this treatment will be rendered completely infertile. He also explains that there's a similar parasite that he refers to as the one that covers, which attach themselves to the host's skin and give them incredible abilities. He just so happens to be a carrier of these parasites, having lived to be over 100 years old already. His research of these parasites was stolen by Cypher as well, and used to produce the skulls, and due to the similarities between their abilities, we can safely assume that Quiet gained her abilities from these parasites as well. He then asks us if we've seen any of Cypher's vehicles around, and Snake tells him about how we captured a cargo truck of theirs with some minerals inside. Code Talker asks us what became of the metallic archaea, but just then, we fly into what looks like some sort of storm cloud that does a ton of damage to the chopper and sends us spiraling into a crash. We wake up shortly afterwards, crawling out of the wreckage, and finding that the chopper has been covered in some sort of rust. Miller tells us that the new support chopper they've sent out can't get close to us due to the heavy mist in the area, so we pull Code Talker out of the wreckage to carry him out, but he says that they are coming. We then see a nearby soldier having the life drained from his body before some skulls round the corner and start moving slowly towards us. We get into a boss fight with them and their puppet soldiers, and this is probably my favorite boss encounter in the game. We have to run around the area, fighting these heavier skulls in a fair fight with no experimental rocket launchers to save us this time. They're incredibly tough, so much so that I actually had to quit out of the fight and redeploy with some heavier body armor and firepower to even stand a chance of dealing with them. When they're not using their rifles to shoot at us from far away, they blink all over the place, using machetes to chop away at us once they've gotten in close. But these melee attacks of theirs are actually what makes the fight so enjoyable, as if you press the CQC button right as the attack is about to connect, you can actually counterattack them using CQC to not only avoid the damage, but also deal some damage back and stun them for a short time. It's not an easy fight, but it's incredibly fun, and once you fall into the groove of countering their machete attacks, it's easily one of the most satisfying boss encounters the franchise has ever seen. Once we've defeated the last of them, the mist in the area clears, and the chopper is able to land to pick us up. On the way back to Mother Base, Code Talker tells us that Skullface is no longer in Africa. He says that the nuclear test was a success, so now he's turned his knives on him. Miller doesn't know what tests he's talking about, so Code Talker explains that the detonation tests took place 5 years ago. The recent tests were performed with the opposite goal, with them trying to prevent detonations rather than induce them. He says that Skullface plans to sell nuclear weapons to other nations and powers, but he wants to maintain control of those weapons to ensure that they're never turned on him. He would do this using his metallic archaea, single-celled organisms that have the ability to quickly corrode any metal, allowing them to destroy the detonators on incoming nuclear weapons before they ever reach their targets. He also explains that these archaea would be moved around while hidden inside tiny deposits of uranium to ensure that no one would find out about this plan. Ocelot remarks that if they're able to put this new technology into action, all existing nuclear weapons become completely useless, and the two world superpowers would become completely powerless, leaving them at the mercy of Skullface. Soon after this, we arrive back at Mother Base, and Code Talker quickly gets to work on treating the infection. He says that these are textbook symptoms of a vocal parasite infestation, saying that based on our casualty list, it seems to be the Kakongo strain. And man, when he spoke those words, I felt such relief. The puzzle of figuring out how the infection is spreading through your base isn't an easy one to solve and is far from your typical puzzle, but if you put all the clues the game gives you together, it's incredibly satisfying to figure it out. Code Talker gets to work on turning all the male parasites into females, and within only 48 hours, we've managed to ensure that there will be no further vocal parasite infections among our staff. And some of you might be expecting me to talk about how ridiculous it is that Metal Gear decided to jump the shark and go from nuclear weapons being the world-ending threat to cleverly designed bioweapons, but it just so happens that one of my favorite gaming franchises of all time is Resident Evil, so I actually found myself absolutely enthralled by this portion of the story. The sudden appearance of an infection that you don't understand and need to find the origins of quickly before it kills all of your men was far from expected, but added some real stakes to the game, and I actually found it to be a really fun part of the game's overall narrative. It might honestly be my favorite part of this game's story, but the other contender for that title is still yet to come, so I'll keep my mouth shut for the time being. Once the virus is cured, Ocelot and Miller get to interrogating Huey so we can figure out where Skullface went. They threaten to use some of the recovered metallic archaea to eat through his new mechanical legs, which forces him to tell us that he's headed for a base in Afghanistan where he plans to unveil Sahelanthropus and launch his new nuclear market. So we quickly deploy back to Afghanistan, sneaking our way through the base in one final push to prevent Skullface's plans. We eventually find him on the helipad, and he says that we've known loss much like him, loss that still torments us to this day. He says that we're hoping the hatred will replace the pain, but tells us that it will never go away, even if we see that hatred through. He remarks that we're both demons with no place to run, and instead of having his men open fire on us, he asks us to walk with him. We do so, and along the way, he explains that he's known us since our time in the CIA, saying that he's been our shadow for a long time. He says that he was there for the virtuous mission in Operation Snake Eater, cleaning up after us by ensuring that there were no bodies or bullet casings left behind, and relaying our mission status back to the CIA every step of the way, completely unbeknownst to us. After Operation Snake Eater, Major Zero went to Skullface, telling him that Washington wouldn't be able to see through the boss's vision and that he wants to start his own organization to see it through, with that idea eventually turning into the birth of Cypher. Skullface explains that America has always been a country defined by its immigration, and that what sets it apart is that there has never been one American people, but rather that a diverse variety of people from all over the world come together to live amongst one another under the same banner. But Zero had a slightly different vision. He saw an America where all citizens would use free will to unite with one another, but that sort of unilateralism would be completely impossible without a little control. So Zero had a plan to use words to control people subconsciously. Skullface says that the boss's will was to unite America and the entire world, but that Zero never understood what she truly wanted. He explains that since before Zero was even born, his mother tongue was English, saying that he never understood the pain of losing his language. Skullface then tells Snake a bit about himself, explaining that he was born into a small Hungarian village. When he was a child, they were raided by foreign soldiers, and he was torn away from his elders and forced to speak the language of his captors. The longer he was with these people, the more that his language would change, and with it, himself as a person. He says that his fatherland and his truth was stolen from him, as well as his past, leaving only his future and his revenge in front of him. He explains that Zero wants to use the vocal cord parasites to establish English as the only remaining language in the world, allowing him easy access to control the entire globe's population. The more that Skullface sat with this idea, the more that he realized just how much of a parasite Zero was on the world. He decided that instead of following along with Zero's plan, he would instead turn it against him, creating an English strain of the vocal cord parasite so that he could use it to eradicate the language and take revenge on Zero as well as his former captors. He says that without the world's common tongue, everything will be torn apart and the Earth's people will be truly free for the first time in their lives. He further explains that in this void caused by the loss of spoken language, humanity will have to swallow their pain and become one, saying that this war is actually peace, and that is truly the boss's vision. He says that when Sahelanthropus is unveiled to the world, it will take the first giant step into a brave new world, allowing the people of the world to follow into their new independence. Just then, we pull up to the hangar containing Sahelanthropus, and Skullface tells us that we're not the only demons in this world. He then shows us the man on fire, telling us that vengeance is all he has left, and that he lives because of us. The man walks towards us before suddenly stopping, and we see the psychic child fly into Sahelanthropus before the man on fire turns and walks towards it as well. The man on fire is then crushed by Sahelanthropus as it's rolled out, and we see the Metal Gear get activated prematurely, with Skullface not knowing who's behind it. Skullface and his men flee from the cave, and we follow along after them, hiding behind some cover while the XOF forces and Sahelanthropus fight one another. In the middle of the chaos, Skullface starts monologuing to himself about how he will soon disappear from history, but the thirst for revenge that he's planted will infest the system and cause it to come undone. Sahelanthropus then finds him, crushing him under some of the debris that he's standing by. Miller tells us that if Sahelanthropus manages to leave this place, the simple knowledge of its existence would be enough to tear the world apart, and Skullface's plans would be complete. So we get into a boss fight against it, slowly running down the side of the mountain and trying to put some distance between ourselves and Sahelanthropus, and this is up there with the Skulls fight for the best in the game for me. We get this massive area to fight it in, and it uses all of the classic attacks and tricks that we've seen in previous Metal Gear fights of the series, like machine guns, missiles, trying to stomp us, and the addition of a giant sword infused with metallic archaea. It's also really incredible to just see how this thing moves around the way it does, and is the first time in the series that it really feels like you're sharing the arena with this massive unstoppable mech that's straight out of an anime.
It's like one of my Japanese animes.
Miller also sends in things like supply drops and support choppers throughout the fight to back you up, really making it feel like it's the culmination of everything we've been building up to throughout the game. It's not a very complicated fight in terms of mechanics or anything, you simply just dump damage into it until it dies, but the spectacle and the scale makes it easily one of the most memorable fights that the series has ever seen. We eventually managed to bring the thing down, and were picked up by Miller and the rest of the crew by helicopter. We fly back up the mountain to return to the base, and we find that Skullface is still alive underneath the rubble. Snake takes the samples of the English parasite from him, but one of the 3 vials in the case is missing. He asks Skullface where it went, and he tells us that it's very close to us. Snake then throws the other 2 samples into a nearby fire, but one of them is caught by some invisible force before it hits the ground, and we briefly see the psychic child before they disappear with it. Skullface tells us to finish him, so we pick up his gun, and the game leaves it to the player to pull the trigger. Wanting to prove him wrong about my thirst for revenge though, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Miller then suddenly reaches over and takes control of the gun himself, blasting off one of his legs and one of his arms, mirroring what Skullface took from him. He then goes to finish him off by shooting him in the head, but the gun clicks on him, already having run out of ammo. Miller tells Skullface that he'll have to find a way to finish himself off, and we walk back to the chopper with him. Skullface is left on the ground begging for death, but as we walk away, we hear another gunshot and turn around to find that Huey went over and took his own revenge on him. We return back to Mother Base, and we get a speech from Miller about how we'll never forget the things that XOF took from us, with him saying that much like our lost limbs, the sensation of those things linger. During this speech, Sahelanthropus is carried onto the base by a group of helicopters, revealing that Diamond Dogs will be holding on to it for the time being. And rather than ending his speech on an uplifting note, Miller instead ends it by saying that the pain will never go away and that we'll likely never be whole again. The game then shows a statistic stating that there are roughly 7,100 languages spoken in the world, but only 6 of them are designated as official languages of the United Nations. And even though English is seen as the lingua franca of modern times, less than 5% of the world's population are native speakers of it. The credits then start to roll, and this is the end of the main story of Metal Gear Solid 5. But much like Peace Walker, there's a whole post-game and additional story chapter still to go, so we'll need to quickly go over that before I can properly give my thoughts on the full narrative and package of the game. The first thing we see in this new chapter is Eli and the psychic child meeting each other, with the psychic child handing him the recovered English parasite sample before floating off. We then hear another speech from Miller, with him telling the men of Diamond Dogs that even though Skullface is dead, our vengeance is still incomplete. He says that Cypher is still out there, and we know that they've planted spies among us, telling the men to keep a close eye on those around them and report any suspicious activities. After he wraps up his speech, we get back into the field like normal, and MGS5's postgame adds some really fun new content that isn't available during the main campaign. To start, there are some new types of side ops available in the postgame, like going on legendary animal hunts, or going to clean up some wandering puppet soldiers that have been left behind by the Skulls. The latter of which is more fun than I would have expected it to be, as it's kind of nice to just go into an area and start clearing it out with your weapons without any fear of being spotted. It almost feels like you're playing some sort of zombie horde game within Metal Gear Solid 5's core systems and gameplay. I wonder if they would ever make a full game out of that. And hilariously, there's a side op that opens up late into the post game where we're sent in to rescue one of our old informants from way back in the MSF days, and this ends up being Kojima himself once again. Kind of weird that they did this bit in two different games back to back, but at least it's still funny. But more importantly, there's a whole new category of main story missions as well. Well, not necessarily entirely new missions, rather replays of missions from the main campaign, but with interesting challenge modifiers. The first and simplest of the bunch is the total stealth category. This is as straightforward as it sounds, with the mission playing exactly how it did earlier, but if the enemies go into a combat alert, you'll instantly fail and have to restart the mission. They're not the craziest missions out there, but it really adds some stakes to the stealth, and getting an S rank completion on one of these is among the most satisfying challenges the franchise has to offer. Then there's the extreme missions. These, once again, are incredibly simple. The mission plays like it normally does, but the difficulty has been significantly increased, with enemies being much more aware and much more lethal than they usually would be. And some of these extreme difficulty missions certainly live up to their namesake, like the one where we replay the Skulls boss fight from the end of the game, except this time, they take way more punishment and will one-shot Snake with a melee attack if he's wearing anything but the heaviest armor available. These missions are really hard, but once again, super satisfying to actually complete. Then there's my favorite of the bunch, those being the subsistence missions. During these, the mission objectives will be completely unchanged, but you'll deploy to the area with no gear and no buddy support, and players will need to procure all their weapons and items in the field rather than deploying with them. Additionally, Snake will always be deployed in his signature olive drab fatigues for these, meaning that you have little to no camouflage concealment either. These mission challenges are all super fun, but there is a bit of an issue with them. See, there are a total of 19 main story missions in Metal Gear Solid 5's post-game, but only 7 of these missions are actually new. The other 12 missions are made up of these challenges. And again, I love these challenges, but padding out the endgame experience with them to make it seem more substantial than it really is just didn't sit right with me. I think a preferable alternative would have been to allow players to just play through the 7 new missions without needing to complete any of these, and just enabling the 3 challenge types to be played on any mission of the player's choosing after they've completed them, allowing them to engage with these challenges on a deeper level and strive for total completion if they want to, but not making it central to getting the full story of the game. While I personally had no issue playing through these challenges and likely would have done them anyway, I'm sure there are plenty of players out there who have no interest in them whatsoever and simply wanted to see the rest of the story. And I mean, come on, how fun would it be to be able to shoot for subsistence S ranks on any mission of your choosing? I actually took a peek at the modding scene for this game while working on this video and found that one of the most downloaded mods ever for it is one that just allows you to play the subsistence modifier on any of the missions. So clearly the demand is out there for it. But yeah, if it starts to feel like we're moving really fast through the post-game story and just kind of bouncing all over the place, know that it's because there aren't actually many new missions on offer here. Anyway, I head out to get some side ops done, with one of these sending me back to where we first freed Huey from so we can recover the Peace Walker's AI pod. Immediately after we send it back to base though, Ocelot calls in to tell us that the Soviets have recovered the body of the man on fire. He wants us to confirm that he's actually dead by recovering the body, as he's worried about what Skullface said in regards to how a thirst for revenge has been keeping him alive. So I head to where we believe he's being held, find his body sitting in the middle of a courtyard, and throw a Fulton balloon on him for recovery. As he's floating up into the sky though, he suddenly bursts into flames, and we see him ride in on the flaming Pegasus from the hospital introduction before walking towards us. He attacks us, but just when he gets Snake where he wants him, we suddenly see a vision of Snake when he was in the hospital, and the camera pans over to the man on fire to reveal that it's actually been Colonel Volgin from Metal Gear Solid 3 this whole time. Volgin then suddenly backs away from Snake, falling over and going back to being dead once again. After doing some more missions, I eventually get a call from Miller, who tells me that we need to talk about the AI pod. He explains that they found a human corpse inside of it that seems to have been killed roughly 6 months to a year ago. He says that it's the body of someone we knew very well, sending over a tape of an interrogation with Huey. In the tape, they confront him about the corpse, accusing him of having killed Dr. Strangelove. Huey tells them that she upset Skullface, and that he killed her before putting her body inside of the AI pod, but Miller and Ocelot aren't buying it. Huey is adamant that he never killed her though, saying that she actually locked herself inside of it, knowing that it can't be opened from the outside in an attempt on her own life. Ocelot then confronts him about a surgical scar they found that seems to be from a C-section, asking him where his child is. Huey tells them that his son was taken away from him when he was born by Cypher, and that they called him Hal, even though they never got to see his face. Once again, Miller and Ocelot don't believe his story, but we don't get any more information as the tape just ends there. This is a shocking revelation to say the least, but one that definitely puts things into perspective when it comes to Huey's character. Throughout the entire game, we've been left wondering if he was really behind the attack on Mother Base or not, as well as whether he was working on Sahelanthropus willingly or being forced to do so by Skullface. But with us now having found Strangelove's dead body hidden inside the AI pod, it really starts to seem like Huey might truly be an evil person deep down. We don't have any explicit proof though, so I go back to working through some missions before Miller suddenly calls me back to the base again. This time around, Code Talker was doing some examinations to ensure that no vocal parasites had remained at Mother Base, but while doing so, he found that Quiet was infected. So I rush back to base, and Miller and Ocelot are already interrogating her when I get there. No matter what they do to her, she won't utter so much as a sound, not even a grunt of pain when being electrocuted. Miller demands to know who infected her with the parasite, and when she continues to remain silent, he pulls out some other damning evidence that he has in his back pocket. He pulls out a scan of her lungs that show that they've been absolutely barbecued, adding that they found traces of rubbing alcohol in their tests as well. They also found the burned petal of a flower intact in her lungs, with that petal being from the White Star of Bethlehem flower, which just so happens to be the same flower that sat next to Snake's bed while he was in the hospital. Miller already knows that she's the assassin who was sent to kill Snake back at the hospital, but what he's left wondering is how she could possibly be doing so well for herself after sustaining those sorts of injuries, as well as what she's doing here now. Ocelot jumps in to take mercy on her though, saying that if she wanted to kill Big Boss, or anyone else in Diamond Dogs for that matter, she already would have done so. He says that even though she's infected with a vocal cord parasite, she can't talk anyway, so Miller is wasting his time interrogating her like this. He tells Miller that it doesn't matter why she came here to begin with, simply that she's in love with the boss and wants to work for him now. Miller asks him how he could know something like that, and he simply replies that he was the same way once. Which makes this little scene a lot weirder when you look back on it. Miller then asks him what happens if she's a spy, to which Ocelot responds by asking Miller what would happen if he were a spy. He tells him that they could sit there and throw accusations at each other all day before simply walking out of the room, kind of being sick of his shit. Snake walks over and tells Miller to let her go, which angers him greatly, causing him to storm out of the room as well. We follow after him, and once we're gone, we see Code Talker go over to Quiet. He asks her in Navajo if she can understand him, to which she responds back in Navajo saying that she can. He asks her what strain of the parasite she's been infected with, and she tells him that she was infected with the English strain and was sent here by Skullface to activate it at Mother Base. She adds, however, that she hasn't spoken English since arriving here and never will either. And this was actually one of my favorite revelations out of the entire story. Quiet has actually been able to speak this entire time, but simply hasn't done so because after she was brought to Mother Base, she developed such a respect and admiration for Big Boss that she had a change of heart and decided to work with him instead. It adds so much depth to her character, taking her from someone who's simply cool because the writers want you to think she is, to someone who actually has a lot of complex thoughts and emotions, but simply can't communicate them because doing so would mean killing those that she's grown to love and respect. That twist about her being the assassin from the hospital, though, does fall pretty flat because, they look the exact same, they didn't change anything about her face, and you only encounter them like a handful of hours apart, so yeah, you're probably gonna recognize her. I don't know if everyone who played the game did, but I definitely did. After that scene though, there are a couple cassette tapes we're given that aren't all that important, but they're worth mentioning at the very least. The first of these is one where Code Talker drops some absolutely batshit insane lore about how the vocal cord parasites gave mankind the ability to speak. No, seriously, there's like 20 minutes of lore here spread across multiple tapes about how man never had spoken language or even the ability to form complex sounds until they came into contact with the vocal cord parasite. But if you think that's crazy, just wait until you hear this next one. There's a series of tapes that you'll get throughout the entire post-game experience where Miller is trying to create the perfect hamburger for Code Talker to enjoy. Throughout these tapes, it's also slowly revealed that Miller has opened up a fast food burger chain of his own called Miller's Maxi Buns. As these tapes go on and we get closer to achieving the perfect burger, we also learn that Miller has been embezzling funds from Diamond Dogs in order to pursue this endeavor, and he and Code Talker ultimately find that chemicals and additives make for a much tastier burger than real all-natural ingredients do. So it's now my personal headcanon that the Metal Gear universe doesn't have McDonald's or Burger King, instead, they have Miller's Maxi Buns. Getting back on track though, around this time, Miller calls and tells us that a bunch of the kids have escaped from Mother Base by hiding themselves inside of transports and shipments, and we need to go and find them before they hurt themselves. So we get a series of side ops that are actually mandatory to continuing the story, and in these, we have to go around to various locations in the open world, finding and rescuing the escaped kids. Doing this over and over again to progress the story reminded me a little too much of the escaped Zadornov grind near the end of Peace Walker, but if I can give MGS5 any modicum of credit by comparison, at least this grind doesn't feel quite as stupid narratively as Zadornov escaping from Mother Base 7 times. As we're bringing back the escaped kids, they tell us one by one that Eli was the one who planned the whole escape. So once we have them all back safely, Ocelot questions him about the whole thing. He tells Eli that they've locked down the children's quarters and suspended their weapons privileges, and he asks him why he broke them all out like that, to which Eli says that they wanted to leave Mother Base and go back home. He explains that all of the kids here at Mother Base are victims of war, having lost their families or seen unspeakable atrocities, and that loss has led to a thirst for revenge. So he helped them all escape and told them that if they were brought back to Diamond Dogs, they better be ready to move, convincing them that this would be their last chance to face the world and get their revenge. Just then, the outer wall of the interrogation room explodes, and we see Eli jump into the cockpit of Sahelanthropus and use it to flee out into the ocean. We chase after him, but we then also see a chopper full of the rest of the children holding the pilot hostage. So ultimately, we can do nothing but watch as they leave with the most powerful weapon currently in the world. Shortly after this, Ocelot sends over a tape breaking down the results of Eli's DNA test from earlier in the game. In this tape, Miller explains that they conducted 2 different tests comparing our DNA to his, and the results of both these tests came back negative. Eli's DNA doesn't match ours enough to be our kid, much less our clone. So at the very least, it's a relief to know that Sahelanthropus isn't in the possession of a product of the Les Enfants Terribles project, right? We go out doing some more missions, and eventually get a call from Miller, who tells us that there's been another outbreak of the vocal cord parasite on the quarantine platform, so they need us to come back to base ASAP. When we get there, he tells us that they already sent in a team to rescue any survivors, but they haven't heard back from them. Snake says that he'll go in alone, telling Miller that we don't know what's really going on in there, so he doesn't want to risk sending in any more of our men. Miller is hesitant, but we eventually get him to agree and make our way over to the quarantine. Once inside, Snake immediately mentions that he smells something sweet, almost reminiscent of a ripe fruit. We make our way through the quarantine platform, finding a scene that feels like it's straight out of an old school survival horror game. Most inside are still alive, but they're writhing around on the ground in pain, with a bunch of them clutching at their throats. We eventually reach the top of the platform's tower, finding a scientist with night vision goggles on who says that he's no snail before dying in front of us. We aren't sure what the hell he's talking about, but Code Talker calls in, saying that the parasites will try to force the soldiers outside so that the birds can feed on their bodies and transfer the parasites to new hosts back on land. He also says it's likely that that's why the platform smells so sweet, as it's the parasites trying to give off a scent that would be pleasant to the birds. This is incredibly reminiscent of how some parasites behave in real life, with there being one in particular that I can't pronounce for the life of me that infects snails and then puts them out in the open to be eaten by birds so they can be passed on to larger, more sustainable hosts. Code Talker then tells us that if any of our men make it outside, the whole world will be infested with parasites, and just then, a bunch of soldiers rush up through the doors, ambushing Snake and allowing the others to get outside. To prevent a worldwide epidemic, Miller drops a napalm bomb on the top of the tower, ensuring that those at the door don't make it out. More infected men continue running up from the tower, however, so we're forced to start shooting our own soldiers to prevent the infection from spreading. I throw on the scientist's night vision goggles that he had, finding that they've been modified to detect the heat coming from the throats of infected personnel. So, I painfully go back through the platform, purging any of our staff who have been infected to prevent the infection from spreading. As we're doing so, many of them beg us for their lives, and Huey eventually comes on the radio. He can't believe that we're killing our own men, saying that all that talk of Diamond Dogs being a family was nothing but lies, and Snake has gone insane. Eventually, we come across a man with a gas mask who's managed to avoid being infected, so we try to carry him out with us so we can save at least one person. But just as we're about to exit, he tells us to wait, saying that he doesn't think he made it after all. So we put him back down, checking again to see if he's infected, and somehow he is. We put him down just like the others, and leave the quarantine as the sole survivor of the incident. Afterwards, we have a cremation ceremony for all the men who lost their lives inside, and we go to spread their ashes in the sea the next morning. Just as we're about to bury them at sea though, Huey comes out, screaming at Snake that this is all his fault. Snake tells him that he's right, and instead of letting his men spread the ashes, he takes it upon himself to do so. He opens up the first urn and starts giving it a speech, saying that he won't scatter their ashes to the heartless sea. He tells them that he'll always be with them, taking some of the ashes and spreading them across his face. He says that he won't see them end as ashes, telling them that they're all diamonds. He then turns to Miller, saying that we're not going to bury them at sea and ordering him to have diamonds made out of their ashes so that they can take the fallen into battle with them. And I have to say, I fucking love this mission. From the atmosphere when you first enter the quarantine, to how genuinely painful it is when the game makes you go through and shoot your men one by one, to Snake's speech at the end where he takes the greatest catastrophe of Diamond Dogs so far and turns it into something beautiful and inspiring for his men. It's just really incredible stuff, and is easily one of the standout moments from the game for me. Immediately after that mission, we get another tape from an interrogation with Huey. Ocelot confronts him about how the parasites rapidly mutated, seemingly due to exposure to high levels of radiation. He explains to Huey that they already know that the parasites were mutated by beta rays that were leaking out of the X-ray equipment they were using to monitor the dormant parasites, telling Huey that someone would have to have modified the equipment to give off those rays, and coincidentally, Huey was the sole individual responsible for maintaining and inspecting that equipment. Huey denies any wrongdoing, saying that it's a wild theory with no foundation. Miller then jumps in, saying that they've been monitoring his communications ever since he arrived on Mother Base, and that they know he's in communication with a biotech company in the United States that's affiliated with Cypher. The two accuse him of making a deal with Cypher where he would give them a new evolved form of the parasite in exchange for his own safety, and Miller ends the interrogation by telling him that he likely won't be leaving here alive. We put Huey on trial, with Ocelot and Miller filling our men in on everything Huey has done over the last 9 years. The attack on MSF, helping Eli escape with Sahelanthropus, mutating the parasites, and even the murder of Dr. Strangelove. Huey denies everything, but Miller calls in a witness, bringing the AI pod into the room. The pod plays a recording of Strangelove's final moments where we hear her banging on the inside of the pod and begging Huey to let her out of it. Miller cuts off the recording, but drops some new info that we also got from the AI pod, revealing that Huey was using his son Hal as a human test pilot for a new Metal Gear. Strangelove didn't like that he was involving their son in his work though, so she had him hidden away in America, which angered Huey to the point where he locked her inside the pod and let her suffocate inside of it. Huey continues to deny everything, but Miller and the men have already made up their minds, declaring him guilty and calling for him to be killed. Snake walks over, telling Miller to prepare a life raft with enough food and water to last for a few days, saying that we are not responsible to judge an enemy. Miller doesn't like his decision, but does exactly as he asks, and we send Huey out to drift in the ocean until he's either found or dies. Even as we lower him into the water, he continues to blame everyone but himself, and Miller says that it will be no time until he's back on land and telling stories of the foolishness of diamond dogs. Ocelot argues, however, that one day he'll see everything that he's done and that he can't run from himself forever. Once he's gone, we're given the full uncut recording of Strangelove's final moments, and while there's not really much here that we didn't already know, there is one little detail that's particularly interesting. During her short time in America after the events of Peace Walker, she returned to working for DARPA, and Zero personally tasked her with creating a network of artificial intelligence for him, meaning that she is very likely the creator of the entire Patriots AI network. During the trial though, Quiet manages to slip away and escape from Mother Base. Miller calls to remind Snake of what he said about how someday they would need to kill her, and he says that today is that day. So we head out to Afghanistan to find her, and on our way in, Code Talker calls in to reveal some important details to Snake. He explains that Quiet was carrying the English strain of the vocal cord parasites, that she would bring it to Mother Base and infect everyone, but that Skullface's plan failed because she refused to speak once she arrived. He believes that she escaped after the parasites started mutating in the fear that she might end up killing everyone in Mother Base, regardless of her vow of silence. So with that info in mind, we run over to where we believe she's being held, and we find her whooping some ass in what is easily one of the best action scenes the franchise has ever produced. I mean, she even stabs one guy in the dick like 10 times. How hardcore is that? Once she's finished up with the guards, she comes out of the armory and hands us a rocket launcher just moments before we're ambushed by an armored vehicle unit. We transition back to gameplay, and this holdout is easily one of the most difficult challenges MGS5 has to offer. We have to hunker down and defend ourselves against an onslaught of armored vehicles, tanks, and foot soldiers for minutes on end. It was so hard that I actually found myself calling in every last resource I could, from heavier body armor to the best rocket launchers we could produce, and even multiple support helicopters as well. It's incredibly stressful, and near the end of it, Quiet ends up taking a shot from a tank shell to protect us. Before we can get her back on her feet, we get word of reinforcements incoming as well as a sandstorm, so we have to carry her out of there to reach the extraction point. Along the way, we end up needing to hide behind some rocks to avoid a patrol and wait out the storm. As we're doing so, a large cobra comes up to where we're hiding, and Snake ends up getting bit in the arm, and the venom knocks him out in a matter of seconds. We drift in and out of consciousness, seeing Quiet doing her best to treat the wound and prevent the venom from killing Snake, and while she's doing so, our extraction chopper radios in, saying that if they don't hear from us soon, they'll have to leave the area. Quiet grabs our radio and tries to tell the pilot that Snake is dying in Navajo, but he can't understand her. Realizing that Snake will die if that extraction chopper doesn't reach them, she gets back on the radio and tells him where we are in English this time. He needs help navigating the storm, so she continues to speak in English to help him get to where we are, with every word spoken increasing the risk of her activating the parasites exponentially. This is yet another awesome scene for Quiet's characterization, with her effectively sacrificing herself to ensure that Big Boss doesn't die. The field medic eventually manages to wake us back up, having given us an anti-venom to keep us alive, but Quiet is nowhere to be found. Instead of boarding the helicopter and heading back to base like usual, Snake instead decides to track her footprints to figure out where she went, and we eventually find a cassette tape hanging on a tree. Snake plays the tape, and in it, Quiet explains that she didn't want to be silent. She laments the fact that they didn't share a common tongue outside of English, before explaining to Snake that vengeance was all she had left after the hospital. She tells Snake, though, that the experiences they shared have changed her, thanking him for everything and saying that she'll return to silence from now on, disappearing into the night before the credits roll once again. But don't be fooled by these credits. There is still one more thing we have to talk about. After that mission is complete, a new main story mission is silently added to the menu labeled Truth, the Man Who Sold the World. When we start it, we see Snake and Miller in the hospital shortly after the Ground Zeroes incident. The doctors stabilize Snake, but tell Miller that he's gone into a coma. Miller then asks what about him, and everyone in the room turns to look at the camera before one of the doctors says that we took some shrapnel to the head. We then fade out to a quote that reads, "Facts do not exist, there are only interpretations," before we lay in the hospital bed from the opening once again. From here, we replay the entire opening sequence in the hospital, but little things are different throughout. Firstly, when the doctor holds the mirror up to our face, we don't see the face of Big Boss this time. Instead, we see the face of the avatar that I threw together way back at the beginning of the game. Then, when the doctor shows us the photos from MSF, we can see that we're actually standing next to Big Boss in the photos, and there's a note on the back of them from John Doe saying good luck. The doctor then holds the mirror up again after the 2-day time skip, revealing that the plastic surgery mentioned during the opening did actually take place, and that we were intentionally made to look like Snake. From here though, the vast majority of our escape from the hospital plays out exactly as it did before, with no noteworthy changes being made to it. This is probably my biggest issue with the game's final mission, as I really didn't need to play through the entire hour-long escape just to see like 4 details actually change. I said at the beginning of the video that I was sure this opening would be tiresome to replay, and sure enough, replaying it here for the finale just wasn't very fun. The small changes and reveals at the very beginning and the very end of it are, but definitely not the tedium of going back through the entire thing again. Near the end, after the ambulance crashes though, instead of waking up to find that Ishmael isn't there, we instead get a cutscene where Ocelot pulls him from the wreckage, calling him boss, and telling him to follow him quickly. And here, it's revealed that Ishmael was actually the real Big Boss, and Ocelot sets him up with a motorcycle as well as a new identity, telling him that from now on, we will take his place as Snake. And I love this reveal that the real Big Boss was actually the man who was watching over us in the hospital all that time. It's revealed in tapes after this mission that he did in fact go into a coma, but he awoke long before we did, and was simply laying low in the hospital to protect us until we were ready. But all these twists beg the question, who are we really? Well, it's revealed here that we were actually the combat medic who was in the chopper along with everyone else at the end of Ground Zeroes, and that when Paz exploded, we jumped in front of Snake to protect him. After this, we see Venom Snake load up that tape in the bathroom from the opening shot of the game, and in the tape, Big Boss asks us if we remember who we are now. He tells us that we've left our mark on history, saying that he's Big Boss, but so are we. He says that the two of us together form the whole of Big Boss, and that we've built this legacy together. When he says this, we actually see Venom smile, showing us that he doesn't feel betrayed in learning all this, but instead, he's fully willing to give his life for Big Boss and take on his new role, despite all the deception behind it. Venom then removes the tape from his cassette player, flipping it over to the other side where it says Operation Intrude N313, and plays it again in a separate cassette player that's next to an MSX computer on the desk. And this, along with the fact that we're told this scene takes place inside of Outer Heaven, is a not so subtle nod to Venom Snake actually being the Big Boss who is present and dies in the events of the original Metal Gear game. This reveal ties up so many loose ends in both MGS5 and the series as a whole. Obviously, the fact that we killed Big Boss in the original Metal Gear only to have him return in Metal Gear 2 with no lasting injuries from that encounter is very directly cleared up by this. It was Venom Snake who was killed by Solid Snake in Outer Heaven, which is why we then see Big Boss 4 years later in Zanzibar Land as if that never happened. I've seen some people say that the message at the end of the original Metal Gear was always meant to imply that there were 2 big bosses, but personally, I don't think that that's the case at all. I always interpreted that message as Big Boss is still alive, rather than there are 2 big bosses and this twist was planned 30 years in advance when Kojima never even planned to make a sequel to the original game. It also explains why Venom was so quiet throughout the majority of the game. Venom Snake was always meant to be a sort of self-insert for the player. And sure, he's a distinct character of his own in the context of the game, but his past before the day of the Ground Zeroes incident is a totally blank slate, allowing for players to make Venom Snake whoever they really want him to be. And this intention is made very clear in the ending, with Big Boss not so subtly speaking to the players directly when he says that we built up this legend together. Having him talk less makes a lot more sense from this perspective, as the more that a player character speaks in a game, the more you risk a disconnect between their personality and motivations and those of the player. It even explains why Eli's DNA test came back negative, despite how much everyone thought it was going to be positive, as Venom's DNA obviously wouldn't match that of Big Boss or either of the twins. It's also revealed in tapes after this scene that Zero was actually not affiliated with Skullface or his plans in either this game or Ground Zeroes, and that he was actually the one who made the order to turn the medic into a double of Big Boss, as he actually wanted to protect Snake. There's a whole lot to get into with that, but quite frankly, this video is long enough, and getting into the deeper parts of Zero's character motivation is honestly a little outside the scope of this video. Anyway, we then get a post-credits scene where Ocelot explains everything to Miller. Ocelot was actually in on the lie with Zero this entire time, and he tells him that the real Big Boss is working on creating his own new nation. Hearing this, Miller is disgusted by the deception of the man he considered to be his closest ally, vowing to stand by Venom and Big Boss's son David in the hopes of one day contributing to his downfall. Ocelot responds by saying that the two sons are fated to fight one another someday, as there's only room for one Big Boss in the world, so if Miller is going to keep an eye on David, he'll keep an eye on Eli. He tells Miller that the two of them will eventually become enemies when the day comes that the two sons face off, to which Miller tells him that that's fine by him, and until then, he's going to help Venom and David become stronger. And this ending is a pretty mixed bag for me. I think a lot of the twists and revelations within it, while not totally necessary in the grander scheme of the Metal Gear plot, are really fun and add a lot to the story. But the thing about this ending is that it ultimately leaves us with just as many questions as it does answers. How do we even know that Eli is really liquid if the DNA test came back negative? We just all assumed that? What was the identity of the psychic child? And what the hell happened to Sahelanthropus and the remaining English parasite after the kids escaped with them? These are all questions that really need to be answered, and the thing is, they were actually supposed to be answered by the time you complete the game. In the bonus content of the collector's edition of the game, there's about 20 minutes of cutscenes that were roughly 30% complete when they had to be cut from the game due to time constraints. These are all from a cut final mission where we would have tracked Eli and the kids to an island off the coast of Central Africa and gone in to destroy Sahelanthropus and the vocal cord parasite sample. And while the original script of this video did actually include a breakdown of those cutscenes, I've decided that I don't want to include that anymore. To go off script and be totally frank with you guys, I really empathize with the team who put so much work into this story and especially this ending only to have it cut from the game, but at the same time, it would be totally unfair of me to include a rundown of the cut content and give some more credit to the ending when that's just not what we got in the finished product. This was obviously cut because Konami had just invested too much into this game and needed to put it out and make a return on their investment, and as someone with a background in game design, I know firsthand just how much these conflicts with publishers really hurt the team, but once again, it would be totally unfair of me to include it in this review because quite frankly, that's just not the product that we got. If you haven't seen it for yourself though, I do highly recommend going on YouTube and just looking up MGS5 episode 51, as there is some good stuff in there and I do think that you should see it if you haven't already. Getting back on track though, with all that covered, how do I feel about the game overall? Well, I thoroughly enjoyed my time with the game for the entirety of my whopping 84-hour playthrough, but I can't help but feel like the package is heavily flawed throughout. There are some core gameplay systems that I think could still use some polishing, but more importantly, I think that the story is largely unsatisfying. When the story is firing on all cylinders, it's fantastic, with the game having all the deception and the symbolism that we've come to love from the Metal Gear franchise. It's an amazing story about the consequences of obsession, carving one's own path, the importance of the spoken word and the link between it and our cultures, but when it's not, it feels rushed, poorly paced, and obviously just leaves a ton of its key plot threads unresolved unless you bought the collector's edition of the game. I think that Metal Gear Solid 5 easily has the best gameplay of the series, but the story seriously holds it back when compared to its predecessors. This has made The Phantom Pain the hardest game for me to score out of the entire franchise, as I really can't find a good spot to put it that reflects both the brilliance of its gameplay and the failures of its storytelling. Ultimately, gameplay will always be more important to me personally, but when the story leaves you this unsatisfied, it's really hard to just look past it. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain an 8.8. Hey guys, thanks for making it all the way to the end of this 2-hour monster. If you made it this far, I'm assuming you enjoyed it, so if you want to support the channel further, consider checking out my Patreon and joining the group of amazing people who make videos like this one possible. And before you go, this is your last chance to check out the poll linked in the comments below and make your voice heard on what you would like to see me cover on the channel next. You can select as many options as you want, so please just check the box next to any series you would like me to do, rather than just the one that you like the most. And for those of you out there who were sad about the Metal Gear series coming to a close, don't worry, because there is still one more game to look at. So with all that said, I'll hope to see all of you right here for the next Metal Gear review.